Thank you. So I can see all of you. I'm very sorry for not being there. I would have loved to be back to Jerusalem after 44 years. I was there in Jerusalem 44 years ago, so it was a long time ago. I was in my youth, so it would have been very nice to be there again. But I'm sorry, so just to give my presentation online, and maybe my presentation will be about a topic which is somehow far away, far remote from the interest of most of you. I guess that none of you has background in Chinese studies. Is that correct? Apart from Alessandro, that should be there around somewhere. Okay. So apart from Alessandro, I understand this. So I will share with you my presentation, and I will go on for roughly an hour or so, and then, but you can interrupt me anytime if something is not clear enough. I start sharing if you allow me, yes, this is it. I hope you can see my presentation now, do you? Okay. Can you see the presentation now?
Yes.
Great. Then there is an handout that I will use later on in my presentation. It's a long handout, which is part of a chapter of young colleagues of mine about Chinese grammar. So my title is The Chinese Discovery of Chinese Grammar. So what about this title? We have the tendency to think that the world is all alike and that every culture and language has the same elements. So there is not anything wrong in this idea, but this is very, very human and normal. When you meet somebody alien, somebody different from you, you will try to find if he has some kind of similarities with you. And so this is the same for languages. When you meet a new language, you always look for something that is familiar to you, since each of us is the owner of a language that what we call a mother tongue. And as a matter of fact, we are in fact 8 billion humans, and we are all alike, but we are all different at the same time. So there is a kind of aporia. We are all the same, but we are all different. And this is also and foremost for languages. They are all alike, but at the same time, they are all different. I mean, this is difficult to be understood. It's something that is the same and is different. So let's go on. This is my abstract, the abstract you have received. I will start to talk about Chinese grammar. Does it exist, Chinese grammar? Of course it does. Chinese is a language, therefore it has to have a kind of a grammar. Can we imagine a language without a grammar? Oh, no. But what is exactly a grammar? I mean, grammar, I will go back. This is just the idea of the concept of my presentation. A grammar, if we read the Cambridge Dictionary or Oxford Dictionary, grammar is the study or use of the rules about how words change their form and combine with other words to make sentences. I mean, this is basic. Does this definition fit to Chinese grammar? Let's see, the study or use, yes. The rules about how words change their form. Chinese words do not change their form. So this part doesn't strictly adapt to Chinese language. Combine with other words to make sentences. This makes sense. And then if we read the Oxford English Dictionary, the department of the study of a language which deals with inflectional forms, or other means of indicating the relation of words in the sentence. No inflectional forms in Chinese, and with the rules for employing those in accordance with the established usage, usually including also the department which deals with the phonetic system of a language and the principle of its representation in writing. Yes, often preceded by adjective designating the language referred to. In early English use, grammar meant only Latin grammar, as Latin was the only language that was taught grammatically. That means the only grammar was Latin grammar, no grammar in any other language in the West, in the English, let's say, English world. So Latin is an heavily inflected language with largely free word order. This definition of Latin is is exactly the reverse of what would be a definition of Chinese language. Chinese is has absolutely no inflection and has a very strict word order. So this is the reason why Ferdinand de Saussure, the very well-known linguist, divided languages in two great categories: semantic languages and grammatical languages. Chinese was considered, along with Vietnamese, the best example of lexical languages. So this is just to have an idea. So does exist a grammar of Chinese? Does the Chinese know their own grammar? As you know, Chinese language is probably, written language is one of the most ancient language in the world. And so they should have something. So we see like two short definitions of Chinese grammar. One of the foremost claims made regarding the grammar of Chinese is that it does not have morphologically distinct word classes. So there are word classes, but they are not morphologically distinct. This is something unbelievable for somebody dealing with Latin. How does you have word classes without having been morphologically distincted? In classical Chinese, most adjectives are characterized by the fact that they can be freely transitivized by adding an object, resulting in a causative or demonstrative construction. And this is one of the features that classify them as verbs. So no variation, no words variation at all, mostly, with some small so this is the situation we are talking about. So do the Chinese have a grammar? So, I mean, this is just to have a picture of the situation. Situation is that we have Latin as Latin grammar and Chinese with no grammar. So what's happened? We, like Westerners, coming from Europe, mostly coming from the center of Europe, that at that time, for many centuries, was Italy, Rome, Roman Empire, we arrived in China. The first generation of travelers to China they were not interested in languages at all. Marco Polo went to China and many other travelers went to China, but they never mentioned Chinese language. They have no interest at all on Chinese language. We have to wait the 16th century to have the first group of missionaries, Jesuit missionaries, and then eventually Protestant missionaries, and then the Orthodox that arrived in China and realized as Westerners that does exist a language, a Chinese language. So this is what we call Chinese missionary linguistics as a branch of study now at the moment. So these missionaries has gained slowly kind of a competence in Mandarin. So this is just a very short stretch of the story. Augustinians, Dominicans in the Philippines, some features of the first Romanization system developed in the text of Fujian dialects, and then Jesuits, Matteo Ricci and other Jesuits arrive in mainland China and acquire some competence in Mandarin Chinese. And then this discovery of Chinese language arose great interest in Europe. And many European scholars engage in what can be called the battle for clavis sinica. I will talk about clavis sinica shortly, because it's kind of a battle. If you get to know how the Chinese characters work, you can understand something about a written language with no sound. And then if you can imagine what was a written language before the sounds were differentiated, was the language before the Babel Tower dissemination. So the battle for learning the clavis sinica was very strong in that time in Europe, to understand and comprehend the language written with such a peculiar writing system. So how did the first generation of Europeans, Jesuits, missionaries, Augustinians, Dominicans in the Philippines, mainland China, acquired a knowledge of Chinese? And eventually we will understand why all this is linked to the grammar problem. So do the Chinese have their own tradition of Chinese grammar? The answer is no. The Chinese has no tradition of Chinese grammar. But how is this possible? They have a very long tradition language, but they only start doing some kind of research on certain kind of words. So all these books that are considered the best example of what they can resemble as much as possible to our idea of books on a language. They are only lists of words, list of synonyms, and list of how to use certain kinds of words. No classes. The only class of words employed in traditional Chinese books about language are empty words and full words. Empty words are grammatical words, and full words are lexical words. Like "and" is an empty word, while "book" is a full term. So this is the only category all this book discuss and take into consideration. Only lists of words and how these words were used. So we would consider them more like text on style and rhetoric instead of what we consider grammar book. So what's happened? The first generation of Europeans arrived in China. This was the situation there. No grammar, no grammatical categories. They start studying Chinese. So these two men, they were both Italian. They arrived in China this time at the end of the 16th century. And they decided, Alessandro Valignano was the first to understand the importance of studying Chinese. These two men start studying Chinese. And what do they have to do? The first thing, imagine yourself arriving in a land where people are speaking a language you don't know. What to do? The first thing you would do is just to find out, to single out the sounds of that language. Then you would work in preparing lists of words. And eventually, only eventually, would start to find out how this group of sounds that makes words are combined together to make syntax, to make sentences. So phonology, sounds, words, lexical items, sentences, grammar. This is a short list. No, this is not a short, this is a list. I don't know how much you can see, but I will show you more. I will go more in detail of Chinese dictionaries. So lists of words prepared by foreigners. And we goes all the way from Michele Ruggeri, 1588. I will show you, this is the first list of words prepared by a known Chinese of the Chinese language, and then you go on until the end of the 19th century. So this one of these examples, just to give you an idea. This is the copy of a manuscript preserved in Rome, 1604, prepared in the Philippines by a Spanish Jesuit Protestant Jesuit missionary, Pedro Chirino. This is what he did. He prepared a list of words written in Chinese, having the meaning of these words and the sound. How does it sound? So if you go on the upper right of the image, you see agua, which is water in Spanish, and then you have the Chinese sign, and then under the Chinese sign you have the Chinese characters, you have the pronunciation. Of course, the pronunciation is the pronunciation of the people he was with at that time. And since he was in the Philippines, the language spoken by the Chinese there were the dialects from southern China. And so this is a dialect. This is actually the first example of a romanization. So the usage of Latin letters to write down the sounds of these Chinese dialect. So you would arrive in this land, you would have these characters written down by somebody for you, and then you would ask, what does it mean, these? This means agua, water, and then how does it sound? And then you write down the sound of those characters in your own letters, which are Latin letters. And then you go on and you would do it as much as you can. So this is a kind of a dictionary, yes, in a way to make up sounds, to link sounds and meanings and written forms. While in most of our languages, written forms and meanings and sounds are all alike or very similar. Imagine in Latin letters in Italian or Latin letters in French or in German, then they are quite similar. But in Chinese, there is no romanization at all in Chinese tradition. This is another example, just to show you, this is the first complete Chinese dictionary prepared by Michele Ruggeri. It's a list of Portuguese terms. Then in between, there is the romanization. So, and on the third column, there are the Chinese characters of that word. So he asked somebody to prepare a list of Portuguese words, like a dictionary, and then he added himself on his way the sound and the written forms. You should notice that has first the romanization, and then third, there is the Chinese character of those forms. So this Michele Ruggeri was the first, since you see it's 1583, 1588, to devise a system to written romanization of Chinese sounds. So this was the first copy of the first dictionary ever published in European books of Chinese language. And you see only romanization on the left, and then after the translation in French, just to give you an idea. This was published in 1670. This, another kind of example, this is a biblical story published in 1605, and you have Latin letters and Chinese characters. Latin letters are according to Chinese sounds, and from Ruggeri to Martino Martini, they were able to solve the main features of Chinese phonetics and to be able to write down, to romanize correctly some kind of peculiarities of Chinese sounds that doesn't exist in our languages, like tones, aspiration, and a kind of two range of nasal sounds. And then this was a dictionary which was very much important at that time, because in this dictionary prepared in Chinese by a missionary, he was able to present the Chinese Latin letter systematically. What is written on top is the list of letters able to represent the sounds of all languages in the world. It is so strange. While the Europeans were interested of the Chinese characters to find a trace of pre-biblical language, on the other side, in China, they were attracted by this technique of being able, with only 25, 24, 30 sounds, 30 letters, being able to write down the sounds of all languages of the world. And this book is very important because this is the first book where it appears for the first time the term alphabet in Chinese language, and then the difference between vowels and consonants, which are all concepts imported into Chinese grammar. Then here we have dictionaries, and I can go on in telling the story about these different dictionaries. But what is most important is that all these dictionaries are prepared according to our categories. Sounds first, then written form, and then the meaning. So the Europeans were the first to prepare Chinese dictionaries according to sound instead of their written form. And this is another example. These are all dictionaries. These are dictionary prepared in Latin dictionary. This is a very well-known dictionary in which the Chinese characters, this is according to Chinese characters and not according to Chinese letters. So why I am talking so much about dictionaries? Because in dictionaries appear the first grammatical category that was introduced into Chinese grammatical description by Westerners. And this is one of the first examples. This is what is called on top here is particulae numerales. What is particulae numerales? Particulae numerales are in Chinese, there is a features of what we call now classifier. After numerals, before the nouns, you had to include a specific term that is called classifier. So it's like one, instead of saying one book, you would have to say one bind book, two bind book, three bind book. It's like a term like this. And then this specific category was singled out by Jesuit missionaries into Chinese language. In other terms, the Chinese has their own language, but they never find out that they can be classified as a category, this kind of words. So this is the first example of a grammatical features still identified now in Chinese language that was identified by Westerners. I will talk about classifiers in a while. And then this is another example. You see all this list of words, and next the sounds and how it is used. This is 1699. And then this is, I'm concluding the part of dictionaries. This is the first complete published dictionary in European language, which is just a copy. This is, I am showing you just to talk about war of language or grammar. This is a war of dictionary. This is the first dictionary prepared in Europe, published in 1813. And why is it important? Because at that time, there was a kind of a war. Who was able to publish the first Chinese dictionary in Europe or in China? And so this Deguigne, who was a French one, a French consul in China, was able to publish the first dictionary just doing what? Copying the dictionary, one copy of this dictionary by Basilio Brolo da Gemona. But he was in such a hurry that he just translated into French only the heading of each term and left the rest in Latin language. So he was not able, since he was in war with Robert Morrison, which was an Englishman, which was able to publish his own dictionary only 2 years later. So this was part of what had been called the war for a Chinese dictionary. And now we talk about grammar. Why grammar after? Since you have to learn the phonetics, the sounds of a language, then you can imagine how these words works, and then you have to prepare a list of words, and then eventually you can start thinking about how do I combine these words into grammars. And so the first grammar of Chinese language were, again, published and prepared by Westerners. This is a list of Chinese grammar books, from the first, which is Arte y Vocabulario della Lingua Latina, which is not found, was missing, to Martino Martini, to Francisco Varo. I will talk only about the first two, just to show you how a Westerner, a Jesuit, well-educated, in his mind, only one grammar, Latin grammar. How do I cope with an alien language? How do I find the same categories I do have in my own language? So how do I apply, sorry, the logic, the category, the grammatical categories to a language, to a new language that I don't know? So I will show you Martino Martini's Grammatica Sinica and Francisco Varo. Martino Martini's grammar, if you have at your hand now, you can take the handout. I will take it with me. If you have at hand on your computer, maybe this is an English translation of the first Chinese grammar ever written in manuscript, but eventually even published, because it was published and only recently discovered in New York as an appendix to another book, and was published. And so what I should do in a Chinese grammar. Imagine Martino Martini. He was a very keen, very well-educated Jesuit. He arrived in China after studying in the best high school and best university in the West, in Rome, at the Collegio Romano in Rome. He studied all different languages. He was very, very good in Latin and Greek. So the first things he does in his grammar is a list of Chinese sounds. First, if you want to learn Chinese grammar, you need to know Chinese sounds. How many are Chinese sounds? There are only 318. So you write down all the 318 sounds. This is the sounds of all different syllables. Then you start explaining, how do I pronounce all these syllables? So you have to, there is a gap between the Latin letters and the actual sound. So just to make you an example, if you take the last syllable, X-U-N, it should be pronounced shun. So you have to gap the distance between the Latin letter you are used to and the real sound of the language you are describing. There is always a gap. And then you have to explain all these. And then you have to explain the tones, about the tones, that is the different pronunciation of these sounds among the Chinese. So remembering first things is sound. So you have, and then you start writing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tones at that time. However, these tones are 5 in total, and no more. And though for those some syllables only have 1 out of 2 out of 3 out of 4, rarely 5. And then how do I write it down in Latin letters? I do use according to Greek usage. So I use my own system to write down the sound of this alien language. And then I start explaining how all these, and then I explain the 318 syllables. In China, different sounds become a total of 1,180. It means all different syllables have different tones with different meanings. It's like ma, 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 ma. So you have all different tones. And then you explain. So remember, we are at the beginning of the 17th century, 1630, roughly. And then declension. What does has the Chinese as declension? Since among the Chinese, every voice is monosyllabic and indeclinable, I am on page, I don't know if you can follow, I am on page 197. Or maybe I can show you also these I can share these two. Maybe if maybe is I can post these and you share and share you. Okay, so these make you maybe it's easier about the names and the declension. Since among the Chinese every voice is monosyllabic and indeclinable, there is no variation of declension in the nouns, and not even changes of voices in the cases, neither of gender. So you imagine, I mean, I arrived there knowing only grammar. The only grammar I know is Latin. And I found out a language like this. So in a way, I have to imagine myself, how can I describe this language? Since the most important categories that I use in my own language, Latin, I mean, the only language has a grammar. I know, of course, he was Italian, you know, and many other Romance language is Latin. And I don't find anything else than undeclinable monosyllabic words. And then I go and on and on. But I found what they call pronouns. So terms that they can be used instead of nouns. And then the nouns are indeclinable, as well as they are not more than 3, first, second, and third person. But still, at that time, I mean, this was disputable. So you see, pronouns is like three lines, 3 sentences. That's it. And then verbs conjugation. Chinese verbs do not have a variety of conjugation, not even have tenses to render with voice changes, but only adding particles. And then, what is the example he does? Amo, ami, I love, you love, he loves, we love, you love, they love. I mean, it's according to the ideas he has of the language, he's doing all these presentation. And then chapter 3 is very short in a way. So look, verbs, okay, 1.5 pages. Would you imagine a Latin grammar describing Latin verbs, 1.5 pages? And then preposition, adverbs, interjection, and conjunction. 1/2 page. 1/2 page. And then adverbs, there's some kind of, he's trying his best, answering, confirmative, negative, dubitative, selective. And he found some of them that can fit into the idea and the categories he has. All this was in mind. I mean, grammar was Latin grammar. Interjections, conjunctions, numerals and their particles, which I will call numerical. This was the category I was talking before. This has been the greatest contribution of this grammar to the description of Chinese grammar today. So this kind of, first of all, in the Chinese language, you will find many numerical particles whose usage is frequent and which are peculiarity of Chinese language. So he found this peculiarity of Chinese language. If barbarously and clumsily you were to say one thing, two, other, or many, you should interpose in between an appropriate particle, which I will explain as diligently as I can. He was the first in Chinese history to describe this grammatical category, this grammatical class. that now we call classifiers. And then, so he was very proud. This is the only fresh things he found. So he explained this in great detail. He do all these kind of examples, because this is the only things that he found out like a logic. It fit into his logic of grammar. And then positive, comparative, and superlative nouns, pronouns, appendix. There are some more appendix, and that's it. This is Chinese grammar, nothing else. So what's happened next? I go back to the presentation. If I can share screen. Okay, no, I'm back to the other presentation. So this is Martino Martisi's the manuscript of the copy of the English version published before. I am showing you. This is copy with Chinese characters written next, with all the examples. And so this is, you know, the part of the numeris earumque particulis qua numericas vocabo, and then this is key sentence. These particles that he names as numericas. So this was the first grammar. But this was a manuscript published in Europe only. This is only in very late. The second grammar you can see in the middle is Francisco Varo. He was a Spanish, and he published in his grammar in Canton. His grammar, as Martino Martini's grammar, has been discovered only in recent years. Martino Martini, like all these manuscripts, some of them were discovered by myself, other by other colleagues, but it's something, let's say, in the last 20 years, not more than these. And so the Arte della Lingua Mandarina was published in 1703, had been discovered by a German colleague in 1996, only 1996. Nobody paid attention to this grammar, has been republished in the year 2000 as the Francisco Varo grammar of Chinese language, and the main part of Francisco Varo Chinese grammar is made out of these particulae numerales, of these specific features of Chinese grammar that has to be if you read, it is certain that by knowing the particles which count things, we can speak this language properly. And since from the very beginning you should be acquainted with them, I've put them here, those which are more common, so that you can learn them. And they all have anteposed to them a number: 1 meal, 2 stories, 3 nuts of joints, 4 cuts, 5 quadruped animals, and 6 horses, and so on and so forth. And then at the end of the page, there is written, there are many more which usage will teach us. So this is the part of the published book. Is a book in Latin, published in China in 1703. And then I made a jump until the beginning of 19th century, 1815. This is a grammar of the Chinese language published by Robert Morrison. Robert Morrison was the founder of the Protestant mission in China. He arrived there in 1805 or 6, and he wrote down a grammar of the Chinese language and a dictionary of the Chinese language. And this grammar is, the name in Chinese name is Tunyong Han Yan Zhi Fa, something that absolutely sounds awkward to know. So because you will see from these words on, it doesn't exist a word for grammar. The word grammar itself had to be invented into Chinese. So when Robert Morrison wrote in English the first grammar of Chinese published, he didn't have a name, a proper name. So the translation of grammar is like the way of using Chinese language, the way of using Chinese language. This is the translation of grammar of the Chinese language. The term grammar itself doesn't exist. I will end of the story with this term. And so in this grammar, in this Morrison grammar, we found the main part is the numeral. So these, again, a poem has to use this numeral, what he called numeral. And then what's happened? I'll show you. There is I show you before the whole list of grammars. Here it is. So we go on from Martino Martini to Francisco Varo, and then we move where? We move in Europe, Museum Sinicum, and then in Lingue Sinaro Mandariniche Hieroglyphiche, and then in French, in England, in France. Then Joshua Marsham, he published Elements of Chinese Grammar, Robert Morrison, Abel Remusat in Paris, Alfonso Gonsalves in Spain, and Nikita Hyacinthe Bichour in Russia, and then in France again. So you see, between the very early grammars up to the end of 19th century, there were all different attempts made by Westerners, in Spanish, in Latin, in English, in French, in Portuguese, in Russian, to describe the Chinese grammar. What about the Chinese? The first Chinese grammar prepared by a Chinese appeared in 1898. It means 124 years ago. 124 years ago. This was, I'll show you the one. I didn't have is the Ma Zhenjiang's grammar, Mr. Ma's grammar, published in 1898. What he did, Mr. Ma Zhenjiang studied some Latin. We are at the end of 19th century. The Chinese Empire was about to collapse, definitely. And so what he did, he collected the list of words prepared by the Chinese before, and he took this Shizi Shuo, this book about the empty words, and he copied. And he copied in a new book. So he mostly worked out on the grammars made on the rhetoric or stylistic words made by his predecessors, Chinese predecessors. He mostly did not consider almost at all these old traditions. I have shown you that the Europeans of different languages, different places, have produced for over 1.5 centuries. So this is the first grammar produced by Chinese. Of course, this is the first, but absolutely is not the most influential. But it should be recalled as the first. Then what's happened? Then we have these 4 grammars. The first one was published in 1924, so 98 years ago. And this, in a way, is what we call a grammar. So a way of describing all the classes of words that we imagine, like verbs, adverbs, and adjectives, and so on and so forth. And then this was, and then we have Lu Shuxiang grammar of 1947, and Wan Li grammar of 1943, and finally, a grammar published on the People's Daily, on the official paper from the People's Republic of China since 1951. So you understand that the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, and 1.5 years after, they entrusted these 2 most well-known linguists to work out and prepare and publish on a daily newspaper lesson on grammars, just to have people learning how to use the language. I have been studying Chinese grammar with Wan Li and Zhu Dexi, with last two people. And Wan Li was very old at that time. He himself has studied in Paris. He has studied Sassurian linguistics in Paris. And I asked him, Wan Li, in 1983, I met Wan Li and I asked him, did you know about grammar in Chinese before going to Paris in the 20s? He was born in the year 1900, and then he went in the 20s in Paris, and he told me, no, I didn't know about the existence of what you call Chinese grammar. And then Zhu Dexi was the head of the Department of Chinese Language and Grammar at the University of Beijing. He studied in Paris as well, and he turned to be one of the most influential grammarians in China. So just to almost going to the end of my presentation, is that the terms for grammar. So remember what I said about Morrison. I mean, he didn't have a term for grammar. So he translated the title as the rules for speaking Chinese. And then we have three terms. Wentong is the first term used by the first Chinese grammar published in 1898, and it means discussion of when. This term when is written language, is Chinese characters. The second term, wenfa, is the law of the written language. And this term was first created by the Japanese, that were the first to use this term to indicate what we call Chinese grammar. And then the third term, what is mostly used now in modern Chinese is yufa, is the rule of the language. So rule of the written form of the language to the rule of the oral language. Sounds come first as you have seen. When we learn our mother tongue language, we are not able to read, we are not able to write, but we start learning our language since the very moment in which we were born. So the sounds come first, written forms come later. But in the Chinese classical way of seeing the culture, written forms come first. So first, they were talking about the law, the rules of the written forms. Only eventually, in modern times, it tends to be yufa, which is the rule of yu, and yu is the oral form of the language. And this is what I have translated down here, is the definition that you find in a Chinese dictionary, in a Chinese, monolingual dictionary. If you look for wenfa, the second term, you find out that you have to reference to the third terms, yufa, which is the structure of a language. Yufa, grammar, including the combination of words and the organization of forms, syntax, and sentences. So grammar for the Chinese is how do the words combine into sentences. So what does it mean? That if you go back to the definition of what is Latin, the very, very, very beginning, so morphological changing, but free order. In Chinese, the order is fixed, and it's so fixed that the role of a term depends from the place where it is located in the sentence. In other terms, a verb is a verb just because it's put it after a noun and before an object. So it doesn't have a variation, an internal variation for being a verb. It's just because it fits in a specific place in the sentence. So extremely rigid sentence word order and extremely great variation of word classes. This is it. So this is how the Chinese discover their own grammar. I've been talking almost 50 minutes, so I'm now ready. We still have time for questions that I will try my best to answer. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much. Let us see. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. You have to just to speak clearly. I mean, since the microphone maybe is a bit.
I can also go there if it's.
Okay, you try.
Is it? Where is this? I don't know where the mic is. Okay, so first of all, thank you for your really interesting talk. And I was wondering if you could maybe tell us something about the connection between the existence of these Chinese lexicons and the urge or the desire to create these lexicons by missionaries, because I work on Kerala, and we also have missionaries coming, first Portuguese and then Dutch. And while of course Malayalam is a smaller language and maybe there were like the political situation was completely different, we don't see, we don't have lexicons in Malayalam, like pre-modern lexicons in Malayalam. And we also don't see these missionaries creating lexicons until the 19th century with Herman Gundert. Maybe we have like lists of 100 useful words in Portuguese and how to say them in Malayalam, but they are not creating any structural lexicons and definitely not grammars of Malayalam. So I was wondering if you see a connection between the fact that the Chinese people, even if they did not create their own grammars, they were thinking in a structured way about their language, if this is something that was connected to this decision or desire or urge to create these things also for people coming from outside of China, or these are two completely different things.
Very, very good question. Thank you. Language is power. So in a way, if I am able to, if I know your language and I am able to describe your language and to pass it down to other missionaries, these missionaries will be able to have the same power I can have. So they understood this first generation of missionaries of all different orders, all coming from all different countries from Europe, that to understand and control Chinese language was the key for the mission. Their mission was the spread of their own faith, to convince the Chinese that the European way of thinking, their ideology, their religion was better than the one the Chinese have. And then they understood that the Chinese culture is created on language. Without the language, no Chinese civilization. The Chinese empire was created on Chinese characters. No Chinese characters, no Chinese civilization. To be a Mandarin, you have to pass an exam. What is the content of this exam? Linguistic knowledge. You have to prove yourself that you are able to speak and write down Chinese. So the missionary understood all these. So they understood that they had to learn to show their own capability to speak Chinese, to write down Chinese, because knowing Chinese was the only key to obtain their goal. Spreading their own faith, convincing the Chinese that their old ideology was better than the Chinese ideology. So maybe this was not the case in the country where you were studying. Maybe they found another kind of culture, and so they understood that was not that important. Is this possible?
It's possible. Yeah. Thank you.
Come here so that they can hear you.
But also, Professor Andla has a question.
Oh, I will. It's more the sound, I think. You have to be next to the microphone.
Yeah, thank you for a comprehensive history of Chinese grammar. You use grammar in the sense of grammar book or grammatical treatise. But if you look at grammar in the sense of an abstract object in the minds of the native speaker, the question is how that abstract knowledge is transformed into a written grammar. It suggests that for grammar, in the sense of grammar book, to be discovered or to emerge, you should have a written language. And not only the written language, you should have a textual language. I think there are reasons for that. One is to write the grammar, you should have the alphabet, you should have the spelling for words and all that. So that would need a grammatical analysis. So you would come to articulate the grammar. So my first question is, what is the distance between the emergence of the Chinese writing and the emergence of Chinese grammar? It seems to be a long gap between the emergence of the script and the language. In the case of Tamil, you could see that there is a convergence, like the literary text called the classical Tamil text and the arrival of Jains contributed to the development of Tolkappiyam. So if that is the case, then in the case of the native language, the grammar has to be written as demonstrated by other language speakers, like missionaries in the case you described. So that raises the question whether the textual language is the other of the natural language. It's the other which is required to reduce it to a kind of written grammar. As far as I know, there is no oral grammar as such. The grammar is always written in the sense you have used. I have heard that in Sanskrit, the Ashtadhyayi was orally composed and orally transmitted. I don't know how far it is true. If that's the case, then that would be an exception to have a grammar orally composed and orally transmitted before it comes into a written textbook.
Thank you. The point is that, in a way, if I may, the idea of language in the Chinese world is exactly opposite to the one of the world you were talking about. In Chinese, the only language that exists is the written language. Oral tradition doesn't exist. I mean, of course, this is very strong, but the existence of the world is only if it's written in Chinese character. The world is real if it's written in Chinese character. This is, I mean, is the idea of that culture, which, if I understood correctly, probably is the opposite of what's happened in the world you were talking. So the idea of the oral tradition, it doesn't exist absolutely in Chinese tradition. Chinese tradition is only written text. Written text, this is why, because written text is far away, far remote from how these texts are pronounced. And then, of course, there is a problem of poetry. There is problem of Buddhism in Chinese, the presence of and the arrival of Buddhism in Chinese. And this, of course, it's arrived the importance of sound. But mostly in Chinese, it's written form. So, and this is part of my answer. The second part is that, of course, there are rules for combining words in Chinese sentences since 2 millenniums. So we had long tradition in Chinese of combining words according to certain kind of stylistic system, certain kind of rhetoric. What I'm talking is that all this tradition doesn't fit at all in what we, having in mind Latin and Greek grammar, has. So it's the idea itself, but the Chinese learn slowly the possibility to fit somehow their own language into our categories that are not universal. There is no universal category of grammar, but there is different kind of tradition. And so the Chinese slowly learn how to fit their own language, written form, oral language, into our categories. They have changed them in a way, so we have classifiers that doesn't exist as classes, as the word classes in our languages, and then slowly find out and produce what is now Chinese grammar. So we have Chinese grammar in English, in French, and Italian, in any language, in Chinese. Pupils at school learn Chinese grammar as we do in Italian or English or French. But then this is the result of a long process of fitting into our categories the ideas of another language. And this fitting is not perfect at all, since the idea, the original categories were conceived for a different language like Latin, which is opposite, completely opposite to the Chinese one. I'm not sure I was able to answer somehow to your question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you answered my question. I think I understand that one reason for the centuries-long gap between the emergence of Chinese texts and the Chinese grammar is the fact that Chinese doesn't need an alphabet and therefore it doesn't need an analysis of the language. The second thing is the grammar of Chinese is different from other languages like Latin. Therefore, there was no need for a native speaker of Chinese to write the grammar.
Exactly.
I'd like to ask you what happened next in this story. So we know from various historical contexts that missionaries, colonialists, and other Orientalists came to all kinds of places, produced grammars, produced dictionaries, and that impacted the way people use their languages, impacted pedagogy, impacted language identity, made big differences. I want to know what happened next after that 51 dictionary. I can think of two opposite scenarios to help you with answering my questions. One, zero impact, because the grammar was based on these totally foreign categories. It didn't impact the way people learned their language. It didn't impact the way people thought about their language. It didn't impact the way people used their language. Totally opposite scenario, because these categories were entirely foreign, it made a big difference. Where is the truth?
The second one. So, I mean, the impact has been amazing. Amazing. Chinese romanization, pinyin, what we call pinyin, which is the standard romanization of Chinese, was created according to the way prepared by the first Jesuits. See, the idea of preparing dictionaries according to sounds, not to letters, sounds. This is the case. This is the standard Mandarin Chinese dictionary used by all Chinese scholars and Chinese pupils. This is according to sound. The first dictionary produced by, so the idea of organizing words according to sound as we do was imported from the West. And then some
I never used
categories.
dictionary organized by sound. I mean, all these years, I've never used one organized phonetically because those dictionaries are not useful.
And then go on we can go on even teaching, some teaching categories. There have been some kind of scholars studying the fact that some of these primers, the Chinese primers, were very useful to, in a way, to change the way of teaching Chinese to the Chinese themselves. So language, written forms, all different kinds of impact. And then the grammar itself. I mean, there's been a long process to make our categories be able to be used on Chinese language, but the result today is that we have a Chinese grammar which is based by the combination, the adaptation of our categories to the situation of Chinese language. So in a way, and this is the reason why we are still using and studying Chinese, because Chinese itself is an extremely flexible language. It has been able to absorb all different kinds of features from many other languages, even from our languages, and therefore it resists, because as we know, if languages can change themselves, like human beings can live longer. If they resist to the transformation, they died, like happened to Latin language itself.
All that I can say is that I think I write Chinese reasonably well, if I may say so. I've never studied grammar. I've never studied classical grammar, nor have I studied modern Chinese grammar. You memorize some text and then you get it. You can reproduce it. With modern Chinese, you don't even have to memorize it because you just learn another dialect. Because I don't speak Mandarin. I grew up speaking another dialect. So you read things written in another dialect, you go through a few books and then you can reproduce it. I've never studied grammar. Speaking of which, this 1951 grammar, I don't know these scholars, maybe it was an excellent grammar. All that I can say is that communism did something to the Chinese language, like, maybe what Canberra said about the Third Reich and the German language. Or the kind of Chinese written during the 60s and 70s was so impoverished, and if that was the result of that grammar, then I think it's really bad.
But that's an impact.
Yeah.
But maybe it's not the result of that grammar. Maybe it's just communism and a certain vulgarized form of communism that produced that kind of syntax. Now it's much better, but for 20 or 30 years, Andy can support me there, but isn't it true? It's really terribly written Chinese for almost 2 decades. I hold my peace.
Hard to know what's going next.
I'm just
In Chinese language, I mean. Because it looks like it could start impoverishing again.
So can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to ask, I would imagine that the missionaries didn't immediately arrive in one particular place. How did they decide what variety of Chinese they were going to describe? And did they encounter some of the other Semitic languages or dialects, or however you want to call them? And did anyone try to produce a grammar of Cantonese at any point? I mean, or...
Very good question. The first grammars of Chinese we have are from the one I show you in the Philippines. The Augustinians and Dominicans met Chinese in the Philippines. They are coming from Fujian, from the southern part of China, that moved as immigrants to the Philippines. But they didn't realize when writing down these grammars that they were studying a peculiar Chinese dialect, very important in terms of language study, but was not the common language of China. But then the Jesuits from Canton, from Macau, they moved to Canton, and then they moved onwards to Beijing, and then they found out that it exists a kind of common language of the time, mostly on the written form and somehow even on the oral, which has been called like Mandarin, which is the language of those who are in their commanding. This is the root of Mandarin from Portuguese to mandar, commandar. So they understood this was the the variants they have to study. Therefore, all these materials, most of the materials I have shown for the first stage are from these. These because they understood that they want to go to the central government. They want to go to the imperial court. They want to show to the imperial court that their own ideology, the Christian ideology, was better than one. So they hope to be able to convince the Chinese from top to down. Then in the second phase, the Protestant missionaries arrive in Canton, and they have the completely opposite strategy. They want to convince local people, common people. Therefore, the Protestant missionaries prepare a whole set of grammatical books, dictionaries of local dialects. So now we have the first documents on and romanization of local Chinese dialects from the south, Guangzhou, and then Cantonese, Chaozhou, Fujian, and all different areas. And they are all materials prepared by Protestants because they want to go up, down. The goal was the same, spread their own faith. But the Protestant wants, they want to convince first local people, and therefore they have produced a huge quantity of extremely important materials for learning local languages. Not even one single text on Mandarin language, just because the strategy was different.
Thank you.
Just to maybe refine one point, the idea that the Chinese didn't have any kind of formal grammars, valid or not, until this this wave of grammatical thinking and introduction of grammatical text in the time of the Jesuits, beginning with the Jesuits and then through the Protestant missionaries. That's overlooking a very important continuous growth of sensitivity and interest in what we can call the grammar of the Chinese language. I gave a talk the other day on certain Buddhist scholars who tried very hard to adapt Sanskrit patterns, literally grammatical patterns, and see how they work in Chinese. And some of that is overstated and maybe debatable, but they were very sensitive in doing it. Now, it isn't that you jump from there up to the 17th century, late 16th century. It's an ongoing process. In the Mongol period, there was very considerable attention to learning Chinese for Mongols and vice versa. There were schools, there were textbooks, and there was even more pronounced in the Manchu period, when the Manchus not only they wanted Chinese to learn their language, but much more important, they wanted their people to learn Chinese, or they wanted their people who had become so assimilated they forgot Manchu to go back and learn Manchu. But they had word lists, and they had categories of analysis, and they had bilingual text. It was quite well organized without the influence of the Western the missionary grammarians.
Actually, even under Yuan rule, even under Mongol rule in the 13th and 14th
That's
century.
what, yeah, that's what I said.
The problem, so I understand your position. What is this? Is that these kind of texts were prepared by the Chinese mostly according to traditional lexical, stylistic, rhetoric categories. So were mostly lists of sounds and list of words and how they should be used, because the main goal was to memorize. As had been said before, the main way to learn Chinese was just to memorize sentences. So, and the traditional way of learning Chinese, the one I started using, was just memorizing passages, and that's it. No using and learning kind of categories, being able to apply as we do with Latin or Greek. So in a way, as far as I have understood, all that tradition that link the Mongolian, all the other Asian countries studying Chinese language, Tibetan, Mongolian, and Manchu eventually, although these languages, especially Manchu and Mongolian, are flexed languages, have not influenced the way the Chinese have been studying their own language. As a matter of fact, very few words from Mongolian and Manchu are in Chinese, have been absorbed in Chinese, not to mention any grammatical category as far as I know.
Right, of course, you're saying they, on the side of lexical enrichment, they didn't do much, that's fine. Although there are quite a bit of Mongol words in a number of texts from that period, but that's just a footnote. But back in the Tang Dynasty and before the Tang Dynasty, there was this very sharp awareness of the elaborate grammatical system of Sanskrit, and they tried to see those same categories about compounds and about something like case endings in their language. So it's not that they were completely oblivious to this idea, and all of a sudden Robert Morrison came and opened their eyes, or Matteo Ricci. They were quite aware of this.
I do want to say one thing about classifiers, and I think that's a positive thing. It's true that I never thought of classifiers before someone told me there's such a thing, like a focus and like Ichimao and like a cat. You add this word in the middle. I never thought of it before, and then when it was explained to me, then a lot of things make sense to me, because in poetry you can say 一帘幽梦, like a curtain full of dreams, or 一江春水向东流, like a river full of water flowing east, or 摇动一钗风, a hairpin full of wind as you walk swaying. So all of a sudden all these things make sense to me in a
It's not that other languages don't have it. English has this phenomenon.
one sheet of paper.
English has this phenomenon, but it's not used so widely. But in Chinese, you don't have, it's not used universally either. In many cases, you don't use it. You just give a generic counter.
And also they disappear in classical Chinese. You don't say 一个人, you say 一人. So
Probably didn't exist in class.
classify more, but you do say 一江春水向东流.
That's poetic.
In classical Chinese, it was not, I mean, the system was not so complete, let's say. So you can say 一人 instead of 一个人, of course. But then eventually, modern Chinese, it used to be more spread through the usage of these classifiers. But what's interesting is that the first grammar to mention the Chinese grammar to mention the existing classifier was Li Jinxi grammar of 1924. That he was himself the first to use these liangci, these Chinese term classifiers. So, but this is just an example. I mean, the idea is just to make that when you want to fit into something that is completely different, these categories, then you, of course, you have to adapt them somehow. And what is most important is that you have to think that the world is not all alike. There are different systems everywhere, and you have to be ready for accepting differences.
I also want to explain why I never use a phonetic dictionary, because if I don't know the word, it means I don't know how to read it. How can I look it up? So that's why you need to use a non-phonetic. The reason to use a dictionary at all is because I don't know that word. I don't know how to read it. So.
Yes, I think if I can reply, I think the main argument here is that this interaction with the missionaries introduced not like a normative way of making dictionaries, but a way of learning the language. Because what many, not the Westerners, but Chinese people themselves at a certain point of time, like in the late 19th century, understood that having like a phonetic alphabet could help people to learn the language themselves, like seeing a new character, how it is pronounced. You need a phonetic alphabet or some sort of guide. It was the Fanxia movement at the end of the 19th century. So I think what really changed the game was the introduction of pinyin, of the Latin alphabet, or like Zhuyi Zimu, the predecessor. I think this one is the real implication of this.
Also, there's so many dialects. So which sound do you follow? I mean, I didn't learn Mandarin until I was 22. So how does the Mandarin pronunciation dictionary, you only look
I
things
mean-
up.
So, okay, I'll steal the floor to Professor Masini for a while on demand. So, correct me if I'm wrong. So in ancient China, the only way, simply said, to learn the written language was sitting with a teacher who already knew the characters, who would say, this is pronounced like this and means this. Okay, right. That was the only way of learning. And this is why for cultured Chinese, it took like tens of years to become really literate in the language. Then there were also the dictionaries with the Panchie and all, but you needed to know the basics of the language. What you can do with Pinyin, with the phonetic system, adding the Chinese characters, is that you only need to learn like a few phonetic guides, and then you can search yourself on a dictionary how a character is pronounced. It is true that ancient China already has the Fanchie, that is explaining the pronunciation of a character by referring to two other characters, but you had to know these two characters to be able to understand.
But what I'm saying is, this is assuming that we know the standard dialect, which a lot of us don't.
Of course, it's normative. It's
But-
normative.
I think maybe many of our friends are not aware that I'm going to make up a number, 90% of Chinese characters contain a phonetic element. You can't go from that phonetic element to pronouncing it correctly. You'll be wrong most of the time, but it still gives you a basis for looking in some direction.
But it's a
But I
hint.
think
It's a hint.
Can you imagine having so many different ways of Romanizing the language according to dialects? We are assuming because this modern dominance of Mandarin makes us think that that is an inevitable dialect, but a lot of us do not grow up speaking that dialect. So how can you look things up?
Wasn't
phonetically?
there a de facto standard?
No, there was no standard way to Romanizing
No
Cantonese.
standard in modern sense, but like
No,
a common language.
When I was growing up, you look up dictionaries according to radicals, because that's the only way you can look it up. And when they tell you how to read it in Cantonese, they give you a homophone. That's it.
Of course, but and of course there is normativity inside this discourse, but
But what I'm saying is, sure, because now we have standard Mandarin, and that's, that's all very reasonable that we should Romanize and so on. In the 1920s, there was a whole system to Romanize the entire language. This Roma, and people like that were talking about that.
Yeah.
And but the thing is, if you only Romanize, and I've seen Romanized versions of Cantonese and so on, it's actually very difficult to read when you read the Romanization.
It's worth having the point, why didn't they go to some kind of spelling system, Romanization or any other phonetic spelling system? For two reasons. One, because of the great cultural value of the characters, but two, because you don't need it. You need the whole development of alphabet starting in Akkadian period, developing phonetic syllables and then that developing into alphabetic syllabic and an alphabetic script is because you need it because of inflection. In Chinese, you don't need it, so there's no functional value to it.
Also, the too many dialects.
this is true, but we are talking about like a learning aid. Because as far as I know, in China, little children started learning from Pinyin. It is true, it's normative, it is decided by the state, but they use this instrument, this tool, to learn the language. It would take like years to learn the characters. Normative pronunciation, which is something
Well,
we found everywhere in
I'll
modern
disagree with you on that
countries.
very specific point. It doesn't take that much longer for Chinese children, and even before the contemporary new teaching methods, it doesn't take them that much longer to learn to read their language than it does for students in
That's
in other
absolutely true.
languages.
By the time you're 7 or 8, you can read.
Even that rare character you find in one
Well,
book.
then you looked up in the dictionary, and I'm just saying that there was no phonetic dictionary, no Romanization. All this is irrelevant, and we learn to read that
Okay, but
I think, first of all, we have to thank our sinologist colleagues for providing us with a real intimate
Grammar
slides of a grammar
They're really
Been
exercising.
waiting for it the whole week. But then I also want to thank Professor Masini because you've opened up a very fascinating debate. And it was a real pleasure listening to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. And sorry again for not being able to be with you to go on and discussing with all such distinguished colleagues. So I wish you all the best for the rest of your conference in Jerusalem. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.
So reconvene at 5 o'clock.
Yes.
I probably shouldn't have lost my temper.
I thought it was beautiful. I mean, it was absolutely beautiful.
Yes, it is.
So actually, it's absolutely true. When we were growing up, the CPM is a very mysterious word because it doesn't give you the sound, it just gives you
And sometimes the Mandarin 80%.
But if I may, I think the point is, this is how they in the character.
Yeah.
This was undoubtedly affected by all this tradition. I agree with you that it's not strictly necessary. It can be done in other
No,
ways.
I-
It
I-
has
It was
been done
adopted
for
The
centuries.
theme was adopted not so much for pedagogy and for linguistic reasons, it was adopted for political and world entry to the world.
I
culture.
totally agree
So,
with
you know,
this. I totally agree
all
with
I'm
this.
saying is that you really, you cannot underestimate the persistence of dialects, because in Hong Kong today, you can speak Mandarin, but people prefer not to, and for a lot of them, it's really painful to speak Mandarin, actually, so if you tell them that you can look at the word according to the sound in Mandarin, it's a very unnatural thing for them to do, because they would know how to write it, how to say it in Cantonese. They need a dictionary that help them find it in the writing system, that's all I'm saying.
By the way, I agree with you that 90% is political, because I have done research into the Latin Washington system, the romanization system elaborated in the USSR in the 1920s. But their argument is this one, is that phoneticization helps self-education. This is their argument, that, and at least in continental China, it has won. I agree that things can have been different, and perhaps it could have been better in other ways. I totally agree. But
You know, when I was,
you know,
in my time learning Chinese, even through graduate school mostly, we would go to Constantine and all of that after first going to Matthews.
But that's a phonetic dictionary.
Yeah.
But that's what, but, you know, I didn't know Matthews existed, right? I mean, I in fact did not know how to read any of them in Mandarin until I went to Princeton, right? So, but if you look up by Bushel, you can still find it, that's what I'm saying.
I thought there was something
you make it sound
interesting
easier
when
than it is.
Alessandro spoke about these new dictionaries.
Sometimes you can spend hours.
Because you were saying now you can look
Well,
it up
because there's
without,
a separate page
and
that.
it brings to mind something that we've been reading with David about what are the features of the early modern period. So perhaps this tendency, besides the fact that all of these grammars and dictionaries were produced by people from outside who are not immersed in the language community.
Now you can.
But perhaps this tendency and this need to be an autodidact and this need to have a set of resources where you're not at the mercy of a local teacher who can decide if you belong to the right social class, and if I decide whether I'm going to teach you or not. But that you could go get a book, and if you're resourceful enough, you work hard enough, you have some kind of grammar and some kind of dictionary.
yeah,
like,
and I think this one
after learning how to speak. I agree about that, and I see it as a significant point. But is it a contribution to say the part of the speech community who are still immersed in the old practices? There must be a part of these practices that are changing because society is changing. But the question then becomes like, if I produce staff notation of word form, how useful is it for a bird? It may be an insulting analogy, but
you know, I think
don't bother with it.
The real reason behind
But you
this
just
is that
mentioned all the things now.
we don't usually need
Think
to
about trying to
ask too many questions about our mother tongue.
You know, then
It's a very
discover.
common-
I
very
think
common.
the same with your mother
It's just
tongue.
that
I
when
just
you
speak
go about
Italian.
new grammatical
I
editing,
never
you think
studied
about all
Italian
those
grammar
lines
because
that
just
you know.
But you remember while you were speaking in some other talk, you spoke about how there are certain forms that are not
Yeah.
that natural to your dialect.
Yeah,
But you learn them in the learned register, in the formal
Yeah.
register, while you speak
but
those
I
things.
think into that system, I am
requires
surrounded by those
are
forms.
treated as something very
So
basic
it's
that I
just
think,
like an habit you
even
can
native
take
speakers
up,
without
like taking out smoking.
linguistic training
Just an
are
habit.
aware of it because
I never,
Generic one.
I
Yeah.
don't have a grammar of Italian.
yeah, I guess
book
that's
shelves.
why
I have
I knew
grammars
that
of like
that's a
15
kid.
languages, but no
in
grammar
my
of
Chinese
Italian.
languages.
Your mother
Your
tongue.
mother
Sure,
tongue, you
sure.
realize it's that
So I
level.
think we need that sense of proportion about who are the users of
That
these
there are classifiers that
Till you reach a point of rupture, where because of a colonial presence or something else, there's a rupture where a native speaker suddenly feels inadequate and feels the need to not learn their language inductively, but to learn it using the grammar.
It's mostly just used for things, for like things that don't have a specific classifier.
And it confirms my
or
hunch that perhaps you can produce a great body of literature without learning a grammar.
Oh, yeah. I did actually recently read
That's
a
what's very
paper
fascinating.
about,
Yeah, you just, in
like
China, when you go in
development
China,
children,
when
which
you go to China,
actually did
we
say that
often
there is
say,
an increased use of
Chinese is not
grammar.
grammar.
It's sort of
If you
becoming,
want to say anything, you just
yeah,
say.
but still,
There
it's
but
not,
I
yeah.
think this is true for any language. I don't use the grammar when I speak my mother tongue.
I guess that's the proficient
Perhaps
pronounce
it's that the grammar of
as
my
a
mother
sort of
tongue is more complex, more morphologically complex, so it needs some.
Perhaps it's like with the anomaly that you have an implicit grammatical structure.
Yeah.
First, you just don't have a grammar book.
Yeah.
And to make this distinction about not having grammar and not having grammar books.
I mean, at least in some cases that I read it, they say that even the Tsu is a classifier in itself, so yeah, so that you're saying the number one would
I
be.
studied I can't say.
You know, Sanskrit,
and like that,
for
say that,
example, Sanskrit
like
is
that Tsu is the true generic classifier and for, I think,
acquainted with it, but
generic inanimate.
I understand.
But no, like even so you can use it for.
That you want to, I mean, so it's like.
It's not so far from that. It's an Indo-European.
Just like straight.
I know that, but
Learn it with the grammar.
it's still a mystery for me. Maybe in the future.
I was looking at the pages of pictures that actually try to do mistakes. When that comes to that quite one. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah, and I also, didn't consider the fact that even with the Romanization, that would be very much affected by the language that the Romanizers would speak. So that, you know,
But this was discussed. I just
it would be much more like
it was discussed by
too influenced by the Italian or Spanish and phonetics, and might not accurately describe.
I mean, but it's all you can say that either you don't want to do it on that particular topic, that
Yeah,
particular.
I maybe for other but even then. I
I'm
don't-
switching from Chinese, like
Yeah, so I think
to English, for example. You might think it would present a problem.
it's not,
Yeah.
So, you know, the years in which I was teaching this in China. Now, I'm making kids in my class.
no, I didn't say this, perhaps you discussed it too, but
And they would
I
transfer
got a mail
to
from Francisco
alphabetic English
a couple of months ago when
10 times faster than Spanish.
and she said, I'm going to get in touch with you.
Got the idea of reading.
So perhaps the two of them just brainstorming about a list of problems.
But I do remember
I think it's
writing in characters. The sounds of so that's not very good. It's a rather remember sounds. That's also true. But what I remember was I think because Chinese is so easy to guess because of Shanghai Monk, because of context. Maybe
Yes, that's the
why
thing that I
people
was
want to-
Especially context
I'm
plus
not going to apply for visas again.
imprecise phonetic.
I don't want to have anything to do with this.
But you see a word with that, affinity, one of 10 different things, it knows about emotions.
Right, so you can, in fact, you can guess, right? So
What would you want to write about? Would you want to write about Russell?
No, I'm
That's a weird question. For me, if I want to read it, let's say I want to read a classical text.
Did you write back to the people who asked about the Bloomsbury?
I can actually speak to it and bring that to the reading of the text. I feel that my picture text is frozen and icy and abstracted. I need that sense that there's a little speech somewhere about kind of richness of speech around it. First allows me some kind of and from what I'm hearing about, for example, what you said about yourself, I wanted to ask you, does it make a difference if you don't, so suppose you want to read a text in Mandarin, or want to read Confucius or something like that. Does it matter if you speak Cantonese or not, or some other dialect?
I memorize everything in Cantonese. I don't memorize. Whatever I memorize, I can read it even now. So if I have to reproduce it, it becomes like translate.
You do.
What would you say when you said like condos? Is it the same thing for you if you read no, you're doing more analysis trying to figure out how it's putting together.
But that's true, but I feel that the dimension missing. That's true, you're right.
But it's also true that when you read the text out loud, what I'm saying is that to assume that maybe because my Cantonese nationalism, to assume that a certain northern dialect would have to be the determinant of how you find anything, look for anything.
So if you read the printed text, you read it in Cantonese.
Of course.
Always.
There's an equivalent in Japan. Obviously, probably need to correct me, but there's kanji, which is the tradition of reading classical Chinese with Japanese sounds, and the point is that they don't even really think of it as a perversion or something. That's the right thing. Yeah, I think it's sort of almost like the idea behind like the Chinese characters, that the idea that it doesn't matter the sounds, you just need to know the meaning, that it can be spread.
Anybody can read it in their own dialect.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what makes it meaningful. So, yeah, 工程是很重要的，Cantonese 交通是很重要的。So, if the former is more meaningful, that's how you remember it, right?
But that's so much more to this line is just.
They don't know it's in Mandarin. Why? To the ear.
Well, no, they make a real point. They make a real point. The whole point of it is
But I think they need someone to translate because I explained all this in the
say it again. What's that?
The 工程是很重要。
Law, so it's still.
All the sentences in the office.
It's always better to compare.
So I think you made a sample of that.
If he doesn't answer, when did you write this? If he doesn't answer tomorrow,
We're talking
send
about.
another.
Well, in some,
It's a little embarrassing. You see so many things are wrong.
there's something about oral tradition is so wrong.
I think he's better than me. He's written some good things. I actually suggested his name. But I think he didn't understand. He didn't appreciate the audience, and he said he can just throw out some general description of Chinese. And get away with it.
Well, I think what is the trajectory that's wrong, because basically you're saying that it's now they can teach grammar with these grammatical categories is a great deal, but I really believe something terrible happened to Chinese, and maybe that had to do with this newfound business that they did in the early 50s. I don't know.
Even if you're a native.
Maybe that's not fair. I have to look at it to
Well, it's the whole world. Once you start having computer analysis, you can do categories. It's going to lose the richness of it. We're learning the language by memorizing our poetry. But that has to be
But this was really fascinating because
I took French in Taiwan. And there's a lot of it was memorizing songs and poems. And for my whole life, I've always been able to use it. I'm trying to speak French, and I can't remember if what gender it was. Just think of a line in a song.
But from the transcription, the Yunnan has the same
Which is
So I mean, I think that aspect is really interesting. The fact that the missionaries transcribe that give us some clues to how
Sure. It's a reflection of faith. There are opposite positions. Chinese linguistics today, not like that. Some professionals go, but China, Taiwan. So
fascinating thing. Chinese, incredibly. I think I'm too old to do.
China's still very few things.
I'm sure that's.
Especially, and I'm not saying only about the language of that culture. What's happening in China today? It's still a mystery for us.
I did understand I just began to start again.
I would like to hear more about this at some point. By the way,
It's before the 11th.
Yeah.
I'm to apologize.
Okay,
I think that's the because when I booked this ticket, of course,
okay, what's an area? If we go in the morning.
but you're saying Saturdays.
Yeah.
What about the Friday? There are ways of.
Fridays are usually less of days.
Yes, there are ways we can. Maybe I'll check if that's on. It isn't submitted.
But we will also hear by then baseline and then you can extend yourself. You're also going back to the you don't ever return to this? You don't ever return to this? We now want to make next week review about the paper and we'll both of you well, she said that she that's what I'm saying. But I asked if you read it out loud. She didn't get up this question. Yeah. But I like to hear that's what I call my. Well, that's why it's one reason. Are you using PowerPoint?
No, I have a handout.
Sit wherever you want.
And I'll sit here and nobody can see me, so.
Well, maybe.
Let's see.
Maybe I move to the other side.
That goes around. Sheila.
Have you cooled down yet?
No, it's okay.
When I get that steamed up, it usually takes me through the next paper.
No reason to do
So I think you should start.
Yes, I have.
everything against my own
Experience, exactly. You were the one actual native speaker, and your experience was being denied in a way that if it had been me with English, I would have been totally worried. Yes.
Okay, we'll get started. There's a handout which is going around. I hope there are enough copies. I'll just start by saying that my first task in thinking about what to talk about was to try to avoid a war with Egal, who was so insistent on my finding a way to connect whatever I talk about with a war. So I have something that is in fact connected with real conflicts in the outside world, conflicts of power and of money and even of armies, and which involves grammar, not just in a simple static way, but in a way that is filled with recoveries and reinventions. And so I hope that might be an interesting story, but I begin. My first beginning was just to think about where you find conflict in traditional Sanskrit grammar, and it became immediately clear that you can find it anywhere, because as David pointed out to us, grammar is the prototypical science, but contention is built into it throughout its expository works. In fact, I think several people have mentioned that the prototypical work of expository Sanskrit grammar is the Mahabhashya, Patanjali's great commentary on the grammar, and as many of you know, that is written in a style which has embedded in it an imagined debate. These debates have always been, as far as we can tell, an important part of learning about grammar at the higher levels in the Sanskrit tradition. And the debates continue today and are often accessible in a public way. You can see posters announcing that a debate will be held. And nearly always, as some of you will know, the topic of that debate will be the same. it's been used for many, many centuries. And so that's at the top of the handout. Shabdo nityova anityova. Is language eternal or non-eternal? Is one way of translating it. Actually, there are many ways of translating it. And it depends upon who is taking a particular side of the debate. So I've listed the systems of knowledge which most often engage in this debate, and for each of them it means something rather different. Both the word shabda and the word nitya occur in very different senses depending upon who's arguing. So the first one listed the school of logic, the logicians, nyaya. This is a discipline which is concerned with parts of things, with what they consider to be real entities in the world, and the shabda that they're interested in is physical sound as an acoustic phenomenon in the ordinary world. And for them, the question that they feel they can answer clearly is sound permanent or persistent? And their answer comes easily to them, of course not. Sound is produced. A book falls off the shelf. Somebody beats a drum. Person starts shouting or yodeling. And so sound has a beginning. And it will fade away depending upon how strong it is to begin with. So sound is obviously not eternal. But almost everyone else who engages in this debate is concerned not with sound in general as a physical phenomenon, but with a particular category of sound, which is meaningful speech. And the question for them, no matter how they interpret the word nitya, whether they take it to mean eternal in the large reach of that word, meaning existing backwards through beginningless time and forward through endless time, or whether they simply take it to mean persistent or permanent or pre-existent. For them, the importance of that is how that connects with the capacity of sound to create a meaning which is understood by someone. And there are three main groups that look at it from that side. Obviously, the grammarians, but also the two schools that focus on the exegesis of Vedic texts. And as most of you know, there are two branches of this: the Mimamsa or Purva Mimamsa, which deals with the exegesis of ritual texts, and the Vedanta. Vedanta for them means Upanishads. They deal with the exegesis of the Upanishads, and so Mimamsa deals with ritual action. Vedanta deals with the search for true knowledge. But for both of them, the essential guide in these endeavors is the word of the Veda, which is a very special category of speech. And for each of them, nitya means something different. There's been a lot of work on this recently, especially Safresky, who has worked very hard to explain to people that nitya does not mean eternal for the Mimamsikas. The minimum of what it means for them, as for the Vedantis and for the grammarians, is that speech in some form must at least be pre-existent if people are to understand the meaning from it. Father says to the son, bring the cow. The son brings the cow. You ask him, why did you bring the cow? He says, he told me to bring the cow. Why a cow? Why do you think he said the cow and not something else? And the boy will say, he said cow. I heard it, he used the word cow. I heard him use the word cow. So that word must exist in some way before it is uttered by the father. And that word as a meaningful unit must exist in some way already in the mind of the son. So for these groups, the answer is usually that yes, speech is pre-existent or permanent or durable or whatever word they end up, whatever concept they end up using. On one level, these debates, if you have a logician on one side and a grammarian on the other, are primarily just a vehicle for the demonstration that you memorize the arguments of your system, because the logician and the Vedantin are not even arguing about the same thing. And one of them may win the debate by greater skill of oral declaration, but neither one is really going to convince the other. So many people might view it as a lot of time spent on distinction without a difference. But the question is, in fact, extremely important to those who argue against the logicians because of its connection, especially with the importance of the Veda as a form of speech that for both the Mimamsikas and for the Vedantins is a form of language like no other, in that it, for them, does not have an origin, somebody beating on a drum. It has always been there. And when they say, most of them, when they say it does not have an origin, are quite serious about that. For them, not even God is an author of the Veda. The Veda has no author. And that's part of what makes the language of the Veda so unimpeachably dependable, because no one could have made a mistake in composing it. The Naiyayikas, the logicians, on the other hand, simply say they're reliable because God composed them. The Mimamsikas try to get by without God. This changes over time. The relationship between the grammarians and the Vedantis changes over time. And this is part of what I want to talk about today. But before I go into the history of these systems, I just want to point out that a large part of what's really at stake in debates like this, it has to do not so much with the specific topic of sound, but with a much larger and in fact omnipresent difference in views on causation. The different views on causation in Indian philosophy fall into two large groups. The first of them, which is followed by the logicians and others, is called the Asatkaryavada. It means the doctrine that the effect is not present in the cause. And the logicians believe that new things, they believe that things are created as new things by the putting together of parts. Things are caused or created by construction. And this has a clear connection with questions of durability, because everyone agrees that things which are put together from parts will eventually fall apart. Into the parts. So that's one side. And they talk of their model of causation or creation is of putting together atoms to build molecules and molecules to build larger things, or putting together the two halves of a pot to make a whole pot. The other groups that I mentioned follow what's called the Satkaryavada, which is that the effect is present in the cause in at least a potential form, so that the underlying cause changes into, or seems to change into, something different, but something which is not really different because the underlying substance is still there. There are various schools that follow this. The Sankhya school, which I won't be talking about much, has a mode of this which they call parinama, and that involves a real transformation. Their example for this is the changing of milk into yogurt. The yogurt is no longer milk, but it was the milk that became the yogurt. Whereas the Vedantins And also the grammarians, insofar as they resemble at various points the Vedantins, believe in a form of transformation which is only apparent. And I wrote the example backwards. It's not a snake changing into a rope, but a rope appearing to change into a snake. So you're walking down a dark corridor and you suddenly see a snake in front of you. If you find out only later that it's actually just a rope, but it looked like a snake to you. And for a while, that was an apparent reality, and it could have effects. I mean, you could die of fright from a rope that you took to be a snake. So that's apparent transformation. Now, the starting point in the history of this is someone who's already been mentioned prominently by several people, especially David, which is the first individual who put forward what has come to be known as the grammarian's philosophy, and that was the great grammarian Bhartrhari, who lived when, let's say, 5th century. I'm going to try to avoid saying anything definite about Bhartrhari because the great expert on Bhartrhari is sitting right here. And I don't want to get into a grammar war with her. So, instead, I simply want to mention a few topics that will be important for us that are introduced by Bhartrhari. And the first of them is this idea of evolution in the form of an apparent transformation. And the word for that is vivata. He also sets up at the very beginning a connection with the concerns of Vedanta. For Vedanta, the most important thing is the description in the Upanishads of the ultimate ground of the universe, absolute being, which they view as pure consciousness, and the Vedic name for that is Brahma. For Bhartrhari, Brahma is in fact Shabda. It is sound, it is language, and so he presents the compound Shabda Brahma, which encapsulates the idea that the ultimate reality, ultimately the only true reality in the world, is language. Everything, all phenomenal things that we see are simply manifestations of the language principle. He also introduces the idea of levels of language, which I think will not be so important for us. And the idea, which I've already touched on, that ultimate reality is non-dual, in the sense that all the phenomenal things that may appear to be different from the ultimate reality are really just manifestations of it, which are not on the same level of reality. So the word for non-duality is Advaita, which is in the name of the type of Vedanta I'll be talking about, Advaita Vedanta. Bhartrhari is also connected with the use of this word combined with the word Shabda. So his system is called, in metaphysical terms, Shabdadvaita, linguistic non-duality. And he puts all of this quite succinctly. In fact, it packs in a very impressive amount of information in the first 2 verses of his great Bhakti Vidya. I should say that Bhartrhari was a grammarian. We also have from him some surviving portions of a commentary on the great commentary of Patanjali on Panini's grammar. But we're talking here about his work on the philosophy of grammar, the Bhakti Vidya. And so he says in the first verse, Anadi Nidhanam Brahma. So this is the Brahma. So the ultimate reality, Brahma is Anadi Nidhanam, has no beginning or end. Shabda Tattvam. It is the linguistic essence. Yet Aksharam, the one which is, Akshara has 2 meanings. It can mean indestructible, undying, never ending, but it also means the syllable. Of each syllable in a word. And this Brahma linguistic Brahma is the thing yata jagato prakriya, from which the operation of the universe vivartate appears to roll forth. Arthabhavena, in the form of, again, two meanings. Artha means, it can mean things, it's all the things that are out there in the world apparently. It also means meaning of a linguistic expression. And his second verse, ekameva, yat, which is one thing only. Amnatam, it is handed down in the Veda as one thing only. Bhinna Shakti Vyapashrayat, but by resorting to different powers, and again, Mariana has written about these powers, power of time, other important powers. Vartate, it exists, Pritatvena iva, as if with separateness in separate things, Shakti Bilah, by virtue of these powers, even though there is no separateness. And the other thing I want to mention that Bhartahari put forward, this will really be the focus of the history I want to talk about, is the concept of spota. The word is used earlier on. It's in Patanjali in another earlier sources. It's also in the name of someone that even Hanani himself refers to as Spotayana. But it has a special value for Bhartahari, which many people have connected with various forms of Kashmiri thought. Bhartahari is apparently, I say he was operating in Kashmir.
Some people think.
Well, I'm one of those people. Spota comes from a root that means to burst open. And spota is used both to refer to the word, or, well, by word here, I mean whatever is taken to be the meaningful linguistic entity. Its existence bursts forth in the mind when one recognizes that that's the entity which is being used, but also it produces a cognition of the meaning associated with it, and that meaning also bursts forth. So spota is comes to be. It's not entirely clear that this is exactly what it meant for Bhartahari, but it's what it meant for everyone else I'll talk about. It meant the meaningful linguistic unit which pre-exists its use to produce it. And so for people who are interested in that concept, the debate, whether sound is eternal or not, for them, sound tends to mean whatever they take to be the meaningful unit. And they're concerned about whether that pre-exists and also about the durability of its connection with the meaning that it can convey. And many groups, including the ritual exegetes, the Mimamsakas, believe that the production of meaning can already be explained by other things that we know to be pre-existent as concepts. Usually they're talking about phonemes. And so the Mimamsa author will tend to deny that we need the concept of spota as something that's beyond the phonemes. I'm going to talk now about a series of people who write within all three of these systems, Mimamsa, Vedanta, Vyakarana, who insist on the existence and the necessity of spota. The fact that they do so and what it means for their connections with other ideas is involved in a history in which these ideas came to be reinvigorated together with other ideas at a time of great change in power structures of southern India. So, and I'm going to focus on one particular character about whom very little is known. His name is Bharata Mishra. We don't know who he was or when he was. We have a single manuscript of a single work by him, on the topic of spota. At the top of page 2, I give you a list of, first of all, Bhartahari, and then a list of everyone all the individuals who up until a certain time, not so long ago, had written individual treatises on spota. There aren't very many of them. I've also listed the people that are taken to be the founders of the tradition of Advaita Vedanta, that is non-dual Vedanta. Let me just say that the early stage of the debates on this were, first of all, comments from a great Mimamsaka, who's actually not on this list because he didn't write an independent treatise on this particular topic, but the ideas of spota that developed out of Bhartahari's views were attacked with great skill by a Mimamsaka, Kumarila, who now we come to a date again, which is always difficult for me, but not too long after Bhartahari, but even closer to the other people involved. Now, in the mixed column in the middle of that table, we have 3 great writers who I call mixed for several reasons. One is that, and they're listed as Mandana Mishra, Vachaspati Mishra, and then the next text we'll come back to later. But then over in the left-hand side, after them, Bharata Mishra was on the left-hand side because he wrote only, as far as we know, the text on spota, whereas the others wrote text not only on that topic, but also they wrote texts within the systems of Mimamsa, of Vedanta, and to some extent of grammar. So Mandana Mishra, the first of them, wrote a text called Spota Siddhi, is the establishment of, or the proof of spota. But he also wrote a text called Brahma Siddhi, which is an Advaita Vedanta text about the existence of Brahma. And here he is a contemporary of the person who for quite a while has been viewed as the undisputed originator and leader of Advaita Vedanta, who's the philosopher Shankara, who has come to, and both of these gentlemen lived in the early 8th century, in the very end of the 7th century, probably. So Shankara has been taken by many modern observers, especially outside India, as the greatest of all Indian philosophers. And many people, when they think of Indian philosophy, they think only of his system. But in fact, he's rather far to one end of several spectrums. He, Shankara was someone who agreed very largely with the tenets of the Mimamsakas, the ritual exegetes. He borrowed a lot from them. He differed from them on some important points, and most importantly, that his focus was on knowledge and not on ritual. So strongly that he espoused a very extreme form of detachment from the world and asceticism, in which not only did people no longer have to perform their required rituals, but they had become incapable of performing them because they had broken their ties with society. They did not have a wife, which is necessary for the ritual. They did not have, theoretically, they no longer had a caste status. They didn't have a home. They were wandering ascetics, paribrajakas. And Shankara taught them they had to be Brahmins before they became ascetics, but they had to have become ascetics. They had to have given up any form of craving for the things of the world. And he taught them only out in the forest. He didn't teach in the great urban centers where the Buddhists tended to teach with strong financial support from mercantile sources. These were men who begged for their food, owned nothing, and kept wandering. And Shankara is called repeatedly in the colophons a wandering ascetic, parivrajaka, and a Paramahamsa, which is the highest title of such people. It means the great goose, which doesn't sound so good to us, but we have to remember that the Indian goose is a symbol of the freedom of a wandering ascetic. The goose is it's a white animal. It has the mythical property of discrimination, of being able to mix milk and water in a bucket. The goose can drink the milk and leave the water. And also the Indian goose flies higher than any other bird, free in the sky. And so these are the great goose wandering ascetics. But Mandana Mishra, who may have known Shankara, they seem to have known each other's works, was much more in the middle of the spectrum of asceticism and in views on ritual. He was, like the other Mishras, was a married householder philosopher. He believed in a continuing role of ritual, even for philosophers focusing on Brahma. He believed in a continuing role for meditation in achieving the ultimate realization of Brahma, which Shankara downplayed. For Shankara, the realization of ultimate truth comes directly from the word of the Veda. You may require a lot of preparation to be ready to receive that word, but when it happens instantly, once and for all. For Mandana, it's a process that requires continuing meditation. So one reason I've called them mixed is that they wrote in different disciplines. Another reason I call them mixed is that they combine action and knowledge in their teaching on the path. Another important reason that I call them mixed is that they're all named Mishra, and Mishra means mixed. And it's one of the things that connects them, along with the fact that the first two, at least, as I said, we don't know where Bharata Mishra was from, but the other two were from the city of Mithila. They continued to live in the city and worked in conjunction with royal patrons. I've asked many times in India what Mishra as a surname or a title actually means, and people say it's just a title of Brahmins from Mithila. But I like to think that it also refers to the idea of a householder or ascetic. In any case, that's certainly true of Mandana Mishra and of Vachaspati Mishra. So Mandana Mishra, actually, despite the great fame that Shankara has now, there's good evidence for that for at least 2, probably 300 years, Shankara was much less important than Mandana. It's Mandana that the early sources refer to as the greatest of the Vedanta philosophers. Eventually, that fame kind of faded away until, this is what I'm going to be talking about, until his teachings, especially on Spota, but also on Vedanta, were revived. This was done partly by the second Mishra, Vachaspati Mishra, who, like Mandana, was an active Mimamsaka as well as writing on Vedanta. Vachaspati Mishra was a polymath who wrote in every important system, logic, Mimamsa, Vedanta, but he was especially important in writing a commentary on Shankara's most influential work, Shankara's commentary on the Brahma Sutra, in which Mandana tried to reconcile to some extent the views of Mandana and the views of Shankara. And so philosophical descendants of Shankara later tended to fall into 2 camps. And one came down from Vachaspati's work, and the other came down from a really hardcore direct disciple of Shankara named Sareshwara, who wrote a book on establishing the fact that ritual is not needed. Later on, in the sort of revolution that I'll be talking about, an attempt was made to combine not only the views of Mandana and of Shankara, but even the figure of Mandana Mishra in the later tradition is considered to be the same person as Sareshwara. And he switched from being a Mimamsaka, focusing on ritual, to being a Vedantin, according to the story, because he was defeated in debate by Shankara. This is a story that is also involved in another thing that I mentioned that connects these mishras, is that they had wives that we know about. Vachaspati's wife was named Bhamati, and he very prudently used that as the title of his great commentary on Shankara. Mandana Mishra's wife was named Rubi Bharati. She's important in the story of the debate because when Mandana was unable to defeat Shankara after several days of debate on whether which is more important, ritual or knowledge, he was exhausted, and his wife, in sort of what Americans would call a Texas tag team match, tapped him on the shoulder and said, "I'll take over." And Shankara said, "I can't debate a woman, it wouldn't be fair." And she said, "I'm not worried, but if you want a handicap, you can let me choose the topic." And he said, "Fine." She said, "The topic will be sexual love." And that was a problem for Shankara because he was omniscient, of course, so he knew everything there was to know about it, but he was afraid it would create a public scandal if they speak in the meeting of this. And so he dealt with that in another version of the story, David, of the philosopher or poet who inhabits the body of a king who has just Shankara found a great king who had a large harem, and he knew that the king was about to have a heart attack. The king keeled over. Shankara, through his yogic powers, inhabited the body of the king, and his disciples stashed his body in a hollow tree. And Shankara started doing his research. But
that's because he was not 100% omniscient. He didn't actually know anything about the sexual love.
He knew it in theory.
Maybe.
Well, he knew a lot of things. He knew enough to become so engaged in those activities that he forgot who he really was. But meanwhile, he was also such a great king. This is in your story too, that the prime minister realized this is not our own king.
No, it's the wives who realized he was not such a good lover, but still it was an improvement over a dead king. And so that they arranged to find and burn the old body.
Yeah. And
yes,
it was King Hungary.
Yes.
So anyway, let's not spend more time on that story. It was a race against time, and his disciples got to the body before my version of the story, the intelligent prime minister who wanted to keep his king coming. In Eagle's story, the angry mob of lustful young women carrying torches found him. They didn't get there.
It's in the hagiography. It's the wives in the version I know.
Okay, I'll get to the possible version. So then that leaves the question: did Bharata Mishra have a wife? And I'm going to end today by telling you a little bit about who I consider to be his wife. Although, as I've said, we have no information on his personal life. In fact, the search for the identity of Bharata Mishra is kind of like the full understanding of what eternality is. As it stands now, the story of his identity is beginningless because we have no evidence for finding out about him. And it's also endless because I have no way of arriving at a conclusion. And so all I can say is that the idea of eternity as everlasting in an Indian context almost always involves an idea of cyclical. And this is another reason why the word must be lasting, because when the universe comes to its end and decays, it collapses, but then at some point the universe begins again in a kind of great bang. At that point, everything has to be reconstructed the way it was left. And this happens through the word of the Veda, which tells it, which stands outside time, and therefore preserves for all of us, if only we can recapture the Veda, it preserves for us a blueprint for how things must be again. So for people who believe in the full form of this, Vedantis, the situation is not that God, the situation is not that the Veda is the word of God, but it would be more accurate to say that God is the word of the Veda. Because at least the personal God is not the ultimate reality, but is available in every cycle of the universe in more or less the same way. Just who that God is part of the war that I'm going to talk about. So I wanted to say a little bit about Bharata Mishra's mysterious work, but first, just to finish the table here, we know about Bharata Mishra's work only from a single manuscript, and there's no commentary on it, but there is another work, an anonymous work composed in verse, which follows it very closely. It is almost a rewording of it in verse. That also we know from only a single manuscript, and both of those manuscripts come to us from the time and place of the activity in the Deep South in Kerala by a family that was known for having developed an interest in Mandana Mishra. And so there's a kind of revival of attention to Mandana Mishra's work. And this family included scholar Parameshwara Rishiputra in Kerala in the early 15th century, who wrote a commentary on Mandana's Spota Siddhi, his work establishing Spota. And at the same time, Bharata Mishra's work was closely followed in some ways Mandana Mishra's work, and in fact had the same title, Spota Siddhi. And so there is probably some connection between the interest of this family in Mandana Mishra and the fact that this is where the manuscripts come from. And I'll try to come to a conclusion on that before I finish today. But the only other thing I want to do first with this table, well, two things. One is that the works on Spota specifically, you will see that they're kind of sparse up until a certain point, immediately after the work of Parameshwara, when suddenly there's an explosion of works from all over India on Spota by a series of significant grammarians through the 16th, 18th centuries. I've just given you one name from each of those centuries. Shesha Krishna from the 16th century, Kondabhatta from the 17th century, the great Nagesha Bhatta from the 18th century. And he has become for many people the ultimate grammarian. And I'll say nothing at all about him because the great expert on Nagoji Bhatta is sitting right here. Well, let's say in your work you've been focusing on people who were influenced by Nagoji. But the other thing I want to point out is that there's also another work which is, I think, of some pivotal importance, and that has to do with a very significant real set of conflicts in the real world. And here I'm talking about the amazingly rich and powerful project associated with the Shringeri Mutt, which is a monastery that claims to be in the direct line from Shankara, and which was very closely associated with the origins of the powerful Vijayanagara Empire. Both of these places, the Shringeri Monastery, the Vijayanagara capital, are in the state of Karnataka, in the western part of South India. And the project at the monastery involved, well, I'll get to that in a minute. I want to say a little bit about Bharata Mishra first, and then explain why I think there's a connection with the activity surrounding the Shringeri Mutt. So just a little bit about Bharata Mishra Spota Siddhi, which we, as I said, we know about only from its contents in a single manuscript. It's people who have worked on it, which is almost no one, have noted two things in particular that seem to be new in the work compared to the work of Mandana Mishra earlier. One is the organization of the book into 3 chapters. I've listed them for you under number 5. The first chapter he calls Pratyaksha, perception. But what it really deals with is the fact that we know Spota exists because we hear it. We directly hear it. When somebody uses a word, I should say here that in talking about Spota, different people focus on different levels of linguistic expression. For Bhartahari, the focus was on the phoneme, which all of these people basically agree is something recognizable. But Bharata Mishra focuses on the word rather than the phoneme. And wait a minute, I've gotten this wrong. Bhartahari focuses on the sentence, right? Vakya spota, right? The sentence spota. Bharata Mishra focuses on the spota of the word, but later grammarians will say that there's also a spota for the phoneme and also for larger units. And so the debate that continues here, which in these works, Mandana and Bharata, is a debate basically between the older Mimamsaka, Kumarila Bhatta, who was a teacher of Mandana Mishra, and the grammarian. And they disagree on whether there is such a thing of spota or whether there needs to be. And part of the argument is that people have the experience of recognizing words. When somebody uses a word like cow, I know that that's the word that that person is using because I hear it. I hear the word, and I hear it as something I already recognize. And I assume that that person is using it in the sense in which I know it. Whereas Kumarila will say, no, all you need are the phonemes. They have to be recognizable, but once you have the phonemes in the proper sequence, it's all a mental process after that. It depends on memory and on reasoning, and you put it all together. This is an argument that ultimately is a psychological one in some ways. It depends upon what the experience feels like. The grammarians say that the phonemes do not constitute the spota. They simply manifest it. That is, they tell you enough to realize which word is being used. And that's why you can recognize the word, even though the actual sounds, this is true even for the phonemes. Why do we recognize phonemes, even though the speaker may have a lower pitched voice than some other speaker, or maybe speaking quickly, or maybe even, there might be some noise outside and we only hear a part of it? It's because the phonemes are recognizable, even if they're spoken at a different pitch, even if they're spoken with a certain accent, we recognize them. And the grammarians are saying the same thing has to happen for words. It cannot simply be the phonemes because the phonemes are in a sequence. They're no longer there when you recognize the whole word. But the existence of that word has been manifested by the phonemes. And so they say it's not simply a long mental process because it doesn't feel that way. And this is parallel to other things connected with grammar that involve the manifestation of something pre-existent. The poeticians, for example, talk about suggestion, poetic suggestion as an extra semantic function. Logicians argue against them and say, you don't need suggestion as a power. It's just the words in the poem. When we say they suggest something, we mean that they allow us to infer that. And the poeticians say, but it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like. It's not our experience that we have to reason it out. Our experience is that something is manifested, it's revealed to us, and it explodes in our mind. So that has a kind of spota too. And in fact, the greatest of the writers on this sort of thing, Abhinavagupta, actually says that every suggestion is pre-existent in a latent form and is manifested. So that if you fill the room with, well, I used to say typewriters, but now I'd say laptops with word processing programs, and at each keyboard you put a monkey or a graduate student, doesn't matter. Sometime in the next thousands of centuries, one of them would type out the tragical history of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, because that is a sputum of suggestion which is waiting to be manifested. And the job of a great poet is to find a way for that to burst in his own mind. And so, again, it's a kind of psychological argument. So the first of Bartholomew's sections is on perception, but what he means specifically is hearing the word. The second, he entitled Arta, which means meaning. What he means here is, how do we connect? How does that word, when we recognize it, how does it convey a meaning? And he argues that this must be happening. He argues on the basis of presumption and other logical devices. That is, there is no other logical explanation for how the word, how the meaning could be conveyed to us without speaking. But the third chapter is the one that people have found is his most innovative contribution. That chapter is called Agama, which means the Vedic corpus. And this is a chapter, first of all, it's the first time that anyone had really used extensive Vedic evidence for a topic like this. And second, it has a very interesting focus. Most of the examples he gives there, I've listed two of them, have to do with the intuitive event in which the primeval seers actually intuitively saw the words of the Veda, which were pre-existent and waiting for them to be discovered. They discovered them through a particular, basically a yogic process, which was dependent upon the clarity of their awareness. They did things that we can no longer do. These were people who had minds that were crystalline, crystal clear through their practice of crystal clear grammar and of meditation. They had minds that were capable of transparent awareness, because they had no veil of opacity that the rest of us have, which is created for us by the calcifying effect of narrative egos. These were people with pure minds, and they saw it. And so he gives a number of examples which refer to this not as hearing the words of the Veda, but as seeing them, meaning directly perceiving them. Sakshat Krita, one of them says that they had a direct perception of them. And another one, these are all from Yajurveda. Etam mantra makashyat. He saw the mantra, mantra meaning pervaded him. Not that he heard it, but that he saw it. So if we try to figure out what's going on in these sections, the prima facie view would be that he's simply going through the three most commonly accepted means of valid knowledge, the pramans. So the first section has to do with pratyaksha, that's what he calls it. The second has to do with reasoning, anumana and artapati. The third has to do with Vedic evidence, which is called shabda as a pramana. But if you look at it a little more closely, you see that there's something funny happening, because hearing is actually not the focus of his third section, but of the first one. And then there's a section on reasoning. And the focus of the third one is not really about the contents of the Veda, although it uses those contents as evidence, and that's new in itself. Say more about that in a minute. It's about the experience of direct intuition as something which is different from ordinary perception. And he repeatedly explains how the primeval seers were clairvoyant because of the purity of their minds. So the reason that I've taken you through this is that if we view these three sections in this way, anyone who knows anything about the history of Vedanta will immediately recognize these as the standard list in Advaita Vedanta from Upanishadic sources in the 3 stages of coming to a direct realization of ultimate reality. And this all comes from a single passage, well, it occurs twice in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Atmava are drashtavya shrotavyo mantavyo nididhyasitavyo. Sage is speaking. This is a householder philosopher who is speaking to his wife. And he says to her, it is the self, my dear, that one must see. That's the direct experience of true reality. And how does one come to see it? One must hear about it, meaning from the Veda. Because only the Veda, that is the Upanishad in this case, can speak to us from outside our ordinary world. One must hear about it, one must think about it. One must meditate upon it. And in fact, these 3 stages form the 3 chapters in a work by Shankara himself on how to enlighten the people. There are 3 prose chapters, which first talks about the passages in the Upanishads that the teacher has to recite to the student to remind him of them. He already knows them by heart. The second stage is to reason with him, to remove any doubts about the truth of what the Upanishad tells him, which is you are that, you are Brahman. And the third stage is for the student then to sit by himself in deep meditation until he has completely internalized this. And at that point, these pre-existent statements of the Veda will explode in his mind and he will have the realization. The importance of this is that it means that Bharata Mishra, although he's writing in a tradition from Mandana Mishra, going back to Bhartapari, is unmistakably aligning himself with the tradition of Advaita Vedanta, Shankara's tradition. And yet, the contents of his work throughout show that he agrees with Mandana Mishra on points where Mandana disagrees with Shankara. So what's happening here? He is appropriating the prestige of Shankara's movement in support of something which actually agrees more with Mandana, in allowing for the integration of a wider range of life. And I also want to mention the first example that he gives from the Veda, which is from a hymn in the Rig Veda. This is a hymn that's actually mentioned all the way back in the tradition. Patanjali mentions it, Yaska mentions it in the Nirukta. It's mentioned also, it's comment upon Vasayana. The verse is, I'll just read you my rough English translation. One, seeing, has not seen speech. Another, hearing, has not heard her. To another, she has revealed her body as a desirous and well-dressed wife to her husband. And all of the earlier writers, Patanjali, Yaska, interpret this as referring only to two types of people. The first half refers in 2 different ways, seeing and hearing, to someone who doesn't understand grammar. And the second refers to the rewards given to someone who does understand grammar. What Bharata says about this is unfair to the Veda. This is insulting the authority of the Veda to not believe what it says, just as these earlier things where it says the sages saw the Vedic hymns. You can't just say that, well, it meant to say that it heard that they heard them. It says they saw them, and you have to figure out what that means. And here, it's not talking about different ways of misunderstanding. It's saying one of them saw her, but didn't really see her. One of them heard her, but didn't really hear her. And so here's how he explains it in the next section, section 10. Here's his translation. One person, though he hears, that is, although he has received verbal testimony, this is the Shravana of Shankara's 3 steps, he does not as a result hear because of a lack of reasoning, which is explicitly the second step, manana. And another person, although he sees, although he has reasoned, he does not see because of a lack of meditating, nididhyasana, which is the 3rd stage. But to another person who has meditated, she reveals her own form. And if understood this way, Shravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana, the 3 stages in Shankara's scheme, also refer to speech as something beyond the phonemes. And so there's no disagreement with my explanation. In other words, Shankara is agreeing with me in what I say about spoken. Now, how did it come about that there was this appropriation of Shankara? And this is where I believe it's a part of this great movement. There's been increasing attention to this, and the latest and I think most useful treatment of it was actually in a doctoral dissertation at University of Chicago Divinity School last year by Nibanjan Maika, called The Rebirth of Homo Vedicus, Monastic Governmentality in Medieval India. Now, he doesn't mention Bharat, but he has some useful things to say about what this project is. It was a project that was carried out with the support of the new government in Vijayanagar by a couple of brothers and other people who were connected with the Shankara line of Swamis and who set themselves up in the southernmost of the monasteries that Shankara is said to have built. But they changed a lot of things in ways that were designed, to get to the point, to help them deal with the increasingly troubling rivalry that they faced from other systems of Vedanta, which did not agree with either Shankara or Mandaramishra, but were theistic systems in South India. The Shishtadvaita system of Ramanuja, which involved the worship of Krishna, and the dualistic system of Madhva, which involved Vishnu in the form of Krishna. These two systems were making a lot of headway, and there was a lot at stake in terms of economic power, political power, even martial power through the governments that they were connected with. And this was their solution. So I've given you some bullet points on what they did. First of all, they sponsored a kind of return to the Veda system, return to the Veda approach. They produced a huge number of works in which they attempted to take the Veda seriously in the way that Bharata insists should be done. It involved the writing for the first time of extensive commentaries on the meaning of the Rig Vedic hymns, which had very seldom been paid attention to before. These are the famous commentaries of Sayana. They involve the consolidation of a Veda-based system of teaching authority and of pastoral authority, in which the pontiff of the monastery was responsible for the spiritual and psychological and often economical welfare of the people who subscribed to his authority. And that authority had Advaita Vedanta, Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, as its premier ideology. And in fact, the pontiff was established with the title of Jagat Guru Shankaracharya. In fact, he took the name of Shankara the master, Shankaracharya, as his own name. And that became something that was handed down to his successors. That's why the original Shankara is now often called Adi Shankara, the first Shankara. But he also took on the title of Jagat Guru, which means the guru. Guru can mean several things. It literally just means heavy, weighty. It's connected with the English word. It's great in Gravitas. But it means a teacher or a father, an elder. So the Jagat Guru is the paterfamilias for the whole universe. And in that function, the pontiff of Sringeri Math provides all sorts of social support systems and still does to this day. Right now, the present pontiff, His Holiness Jagat Guru Shankaracharya Bharati Tirtha Swami, is an immensely powerful person with a huge amount of financial power and prestige, and who is working now hand in hand with the right-wing Hindu government of India to further his reach even into other areas. The new movement brought attention to studying the Veda for meaning rather than merely memorizing, as I mentioned. It involved a reconciliation of the orientation towards ritual and the orientation towards renunciation, and very cleverly made it possible for the ascetics to become less ascetic without losing their prestige, and for the householders to become more ascetic without ceasing to be effective householders. This was done by, well, in a number of ways. The wandering ascetics now become monks living permanently in a particular establishment. They are involved in teaching the Veda and even in teaching ritual. As far away as we get from the original Shankara's ideas, they are still ascetics. The pontiff himself is an ascetic. He's not married, but he is the official head of a goddess cult. The goddess is a form of Saraswati, the goddess of Sanskrit and of Sanskrit grammar. And at the same time, lay people are taught to meditate and to take on various spiritual activities that they had not been involved in before. There's a reshaping of the connection between Mimamsa and Vedanta. And there's a reshaping of the role of Mandana Mishra, a part of which involves the stories that are mentioned and how Mandana became Shankara's chief disciple. And here I'm referring, we go to the Shankara Digvijaya, which is clearly a work by, it's a later work at a later stage in the same movement. And in all of this, they were reacting to the success of theistic forms of Vedanta. And they also had an emphasis on the importance of grammar and on its soteriological role. And this comes out in the other text I mentioned earlier, an encyclopedia of all the philosophical systems, Sarvadarshana Sangraha, which is attributed to the same Sayana or Madhava, his brother or uncle or son-in-law, although many people, including the Mantra, think it was actually composed by a guy named Hindu, but it doesn't matter so much who it was composed by because it was a corporate production. And it does things that were never done before. First of all, it includes within a long list of recognized systems of spiritual philosophy, grammar, under the title, these are all darshanas. They are ways of looking at the world. There is a Panini darshana near the top of the hierarchy in the book. And what it presents is the Spota theory and the ways in which the study of grammar and the practice of grammatical meditation lead to complete realization of ultimate reality. So the grammar, the chapter explicitly says, is unquestionably a means to the highest perfection. And at the same time, I won't go into the details of this, but it does two other things of note, which Niranjan does write about, the non-connection of Bharata Mishra. The placement of this chapter is such that it provides a convenient way to support the theory of Vivarta, apparent evolution, against the view of other schools that where there is evolution, it's real and not merely apparent. And the other thing it does is to place the two theistic systems of Vedanta, even though they're systems of Vedanta, and at the very top, the last chapter is on Advaita Vedanta, they are put down at the very bottom with the materialists, the Buddhists, the Jains, and other disreputable people who deny the authority of the Veda. Because, as the text suggests, they claim to follow the Veda, but they don't really, because they have all this personal God stuff, which comes often, for example, in the case of Ramanuja, not from the Sanskrit Veda at all, but from vernacular traditions of scripture. So it's within that context, I think, that Bharata Mishra is involved in the merging, finally, in an explicit and completed form of the grammarian philosopher and the version of the Advaita Vedanta philosophy, but in a way that is possible only because the Advaita Vedanta philosophy has been transformed into something that is able to play better with the other forms of Vedanta. So then the final question is, does that help us to place Bharata Mishra at a certain point in this historical progression. I'll just tell you very quickly. First of all, relative to Parameshwara, the one who wrote the commentary on Mandana's work on Spota, and who I think was probably responsible for the fact that these manuscripts still exist, the single manuscript of Bharata Mishra's work. I think on reading that repeatedly that Parameshwara must have been aware of Bharata Mishra's work, because when he comes to, when he finishes dealing with Mandana Mishra's, most of what Mandana Mishra does, that is where he's at the point where Bharata Mishra switches to his chapter on the Veda, which is not in Mandana Mishra. Parameshwara says, he says, some have cited Vedic passages here. And he lists the passages that Bharata Mishra uses in the same order. And then he says, but I won't go into that because an earlier Acharya has covered this. And then at the very end, when where Bharata Mishra turns to the topic which is at the very end of Mandana, which is how all words ultimately refer to pure existence and pure consciousness. Parameshwara, rather than covering this the way that Bharata did, says once again, previous Acharya has covered this and I won't talk about it. I think the reason he doesn't talk about it is partly because he wasn't really happy with the Vedantic slant of it. He himself Parameshwara had a theistic attachment to form of Vishnu. And also he was more of a Mimamsaka himself rather than a Vedanta. I should mention that one other very distinctive feature of the Sringeri movement was that even though Shankara and his disciples and early followers like Vajrasayeshi were all clearly connected to Vishnu, Shankara begins his works with an homage to Vishnu. Bhagavate, the exact wording. One of the great achievements of the Sringeri movement was to co-opt what had become a very powerful Shaiva movement of devotion to Shiva, even though the movement of Shankara Swamis had never been connected with Shiva. Now it's assumed that they have always been connected only to Shiva, because that was part of the reworking of the tradition that was successfully carried out. So I would put Bharata Mishra right before, sometime not too long before Parameshwara. Relative to the Sringeri movement, I think he probably comes after this chapter on the Paninian system in the Sarvadharshana Samgraha. But before later strata of works presented in the Sringeri movement, such as the Shankara Digvijaya, because there are things that seem to come up for the first time. We know that that work is considerably later. There are things that are important in that work and by other works from the 16th century by people like Appaya Dikshita, in which a doctrine that, as far as I know, appears first in Bharata, Bharata Mishra's work is stated, which is another problem of reconciliation. How does he manage to reconcile the views of the Mimamsakas with the views of the Vedantins when they are so opposed to each other on the nature of ultimate reality? Even though this is required by the synthesis that they're aiming at, he does it in a very simple way, which is connected with Shankara's idea of different levels of reality, but is put in a new way, which corresponds basically to the old Buddhist notion of upaya kaushalya, that is, of changing the way you teach or adjusting the way you teach to the capacity of your audience. What he says is quite simple. He says that Jaimini, the author of the Mimamsa Sutra, and the ancient originator of the Spota doctrine, namely Bhagavan Adumbaraya, I love the sound of that word, Adumbaraya. Adumbarayana was opposed on the Spota view, according to these grammarians, by a man named Upavarsha. Bharata Mishra says both Upavarsha and the Mimamsaka, Jaimini, they knew very well that the ultimate truth was Shabda Brahma. But they knew that their students were not ready to understand that, and so they deliberately hid their own opinion. And this is exactly what you get later in Shankaratic Vidya. Well, why, if Mandaneshwara was such a smart guy, was he so gung-ho on ritual? Because he was teaching householders, and it's what they needed to hear. But he knew in his own heart the truth, which is why he eventually became Shankara's disciple. So if you look at the dates in the table, and if you put, well, there's only a space of a few decades between the date of the Sarvadharma Sangrah Encyclopedia and Parameshwara's commentary. And that's where I would put Bharata Mishra. The events in Sringeri started at the end of the 14th century. Parameshwara is at the beginning of the 15th. And so I would put Bharata Mishra right in between. And then there's only one more thing, but used up my time. So I'll just say, if you want to find out anything about Bharata Mishra's wife, you can read what I put as an appendix. I put it as an appendix because I knew I would talk too long and wouldn't have time to read it. If you read it, you will have his own poetic unpacking of that first Vedic example he gave about the people, about the happy, what was the word he used? About how the grammarian got lucky by actually seeing and hearing and understanding speech. And the underlying metaphor is that speech, Vak, the divine speech, is the loving wife of every grammarian who really does his job. So I'll leave it at that.
About 15 minutes, okay.
There you were sitting
That was you and not either of those, because I was worried about.
They will, I'm just warming the stage. The more serious question, they will be an easy one. The pre-existence of speech and things like that, is this only about Sanskrit or Vedic or language? So I know that these people are not thinking about other languages apart from Sanskrit, but does this apply to other languages or no?
That's a good question. You're right that they don't really talk about other languages very much. And this has always, I mean, they do in some small theoretical points. This has always surprised me that you can have someone like, Egalitary idol, Abhaya Dikshita, who by any account was a great linguist, right? And yet he never says anything about his own native language, does he? Does he talk about how Tamil works as opposed to Sanskrit?
In Tolkapian commentary by Sena Warrior and Achina Kinira, for the third case marker, what Tolkapian says, they give an example like Moyarchian Piratalan Uli Nilayar. Because it is produced by human effort, sound will not last. So up until now, I thought it was just an example, but now listening to you, there is a philosophical touch to that.
Yeah, and that's something that Kumarila Bhatta would agree with.
Yeah.
But my point was that Apaya doesn't talk about Tolkien, right? And that's kind of surprising. And people have worked on this. Ashoka Klitskar wrote an article that I thought was very interesting on Sanskrit as a supreme language. And the idea was that language, insofar as it's capable of working, that is allowing people to communicate, it has to work basically the same way. Other languages must have some kind of spota, but it may be on a kind of limited time frame. Like it's not a big thing to say that people recognize words before they're spoken. This, by the way, is one of the strongest arguments that Bharata makes about the special importance of the Vedic language. You have to remember that what he's talking about is a situation in which the words of the Veda were seen rather than heard because they weren't being spoken. It's a situation in which, at least in this cycle of the universe, they had never been spoken by anyone. And so the seers could never have heard them because no one had ever said them before. So anyway, Ashok, his article, he says that the basic idea was that Sanskrit existed, all languages exist on a single spectrum with Sanskrit at the pinnacle because of its connection with divine things and its special purity and so forth. But all languages are there somewhere. Some of them are fairly close, like the Prakrit languages. Some of them, might as well go ahead and use this example since I think Ashok mentions it and it has come up. Chinese is on the same spectrum, but it's so corrupt that you can hardly recognize it has anything in common with Sanskrit, but it has to be on there. But this, I think, is a fairly late view, and the reason, according to Kluskar, that it is presented at all is not because of interest in what languages are like, but because of the implications for jurisdictional authority. It puts the Brahmins in, it puts them in a position of having jurisdiction over everyone, because they are the custodians in their own minds, according to the Kluskar, of the Sanskrit language. And it's exactly this claim to jurisdiction, of course, which led the Buddhists and the Jains and other people to reject the Veda, and for a time to reject the use of Sanskrit. So it does come up, but there's surprisingly little on any other language. Obviously, they're aware of the connections, say, between various forms of Middle and Sanskrit, and they wrote grammars and dictionaries of those languages. That involves that they wrote rules for sound change. I know about all of that, and I think that implies that they think it must work basically the same way, because otherwise their theory that Sanskrit has to work that way wouldn't hold up.
Add something, Gary. There's a little scrap of information to this effect in a Sanskrit grammar of Kannada, written by somebody in 15th, 16th century, coastal Kannada, a Jaina scholar called Bhattakalaka. And he's making this case, I think, primarily because he's a Dignaparacharya, because he has to demonstrate that if all of this perfection and this magic potency that he claimed for Sanskrit is true for Sanskrit and the Vedic canon in Sanskrit, it must also be true for Magadhi Prakrit and for the words of the Ankaras. So he, in his first verse is some thinly disguised paraphrase of Pandit's verse, and he says, so I make my obeisance to Sarva Bhasha Saraswati. So if all of these magical qualities are there in Saraswati, the goddess in the form of Sanskrit, then it must be true of the goddess in the form of Prakrit and in the form of Kannada. Otherwise, then it's also not true of Sanskrit.
Yeah, that's interesting. There are things like this in polytext. Remember, Steve Collins had to spend a whole quarter reading text that dealt with linguistic problems in the taking of vowels. And the question comes up in the Pali scriptures, what if you have a monk who is supposed to take his vows, but he doesn't know the language? What if it says, what if he only knows the Andhra language? So he's a Telugu speaker. Can he take his vows in Telugu? And there are various answers to that, but the usual answer is as long as he understands the Telugu and it means the same thing. So, and of course, the Buddhist practice is that there's a whole range of Middle Indic languages that are used.
Trying to absorb this. My question. But the idea that language should be a window onto metaphysics, reality. Now that we find another. But am I correct in thinking that what's really unique here that you're trying to give a phenomenology experience of this kind of, hearing the language, the others, right, but seeing the reality at a very moment. And, let's say that structure of this photo, section 5, the first, the perception, the sense perception.
Yes.
In contrast to the third kind of intuition. Right? The idea that when you hear an utterance or sentence, actually, you have to phenomenologically distinguish the tone. That's not easy. Because you're tone versus need, right? Then the second level, simply presumption, as you said. Carry them all with me. So that it's a very rich phenomenology. If you sort of look to see the reality, you first have to sort of strip it, right, of its meaning to get the phoneme itself, right? And then there's this, this is not sequential. I mean, it's all happening in an instant.
Right.
But but structurally and then formally, and then there's the meaning that comes along with it, and that brings with it this, again, this instantaneous, this intuition of what it's saying, reality.
Yeah.
Well, is that what's really? I mean, is that part of their project to give us kind of phenomenology of the experience itself?
Yeah, but they have a lot to say about that experience, and it culminates in something which goes far beyond this. That is, for example, the way that Bharata Mishra starts his third chapter on Agama, on Veda, is by saying these people who have purified their minds, these grammarians, who, and Bhartahari had talked about the practice that it begins with speaking grammatically correct language, but it leads up to this purified mind. And what Bharata Mishra says is, when a person of that type, actually when anyone sees a mountain or a river or a tree, they are seeing language, because it's not just that language is a window onto reality. Language is the only reality. And he's very serious about that. That for him, first, that for him, all of these phenomenal things are just a manifestation of language. But second, that there are people who actually see it as though they know what they're looking at. And this is connected with a concern throughout the work, which has to do with parts of things. The spota is a unit that ultimately has no parts. And the parts that seem to be necessary for analytical purposes are, I hope this will get at what you're saying. Bhartahari himself says this, and Bharata repeats it, and so does Mandana. Things like suffixes, prefixes that the grammarians talk about and are experts in, the grammarians themselves recognize that none of them are real. These are all analytical fictions, and they are useful only until someone does not really know the language. And if somebody really knows the language, then the psychological experience is not a process of there's that phoneme and then that phoneme and then that phoneme. Even ordinary people recognize the word in a single flash, but trained grammarians recognize much more. And so ultimately, the parts don't exist, but even on a practical level, as one gets to a certain stage, the parts are no longer necessary, and one realizes that they're not real. And the striking thing about Bharata Mishra is that for him, well, and also for these other Vedantis and grammarians, that's true of the entire phenomenal universe, that a person of sufficient realization actually sees what the world really is. There are interesting discussions of how the phenomenal world they are still aware of, but they're aware of it, that it has a different status. We would say it's like watching a movie or something. They know it's not real, even though they see it happen. And for Bhartahari, is the real beauty, only real beauty is the syllable om, which is, and one of the distinctive differences between his presentation of things and Shankara's is that Shankara has this very austere thing that the main topic should be suffering, and how do we get rid of it? Whereas for Bhartahari and for Mandana, I think, but certainly for Bhartahari, the evolution of the world is a glorious thing. It's a beautiful thing. the metaphor he uses for that is a peacock's egg. That from the little peacock's egg, you get this glorious manifestation of colors and things. But am I right about this? Peacock's egg?
I mean, that's it's a metaphor for the sport description.
No, but just to distinguish it from another view that you see here. This view of seeing the whole world, the noun of this view is very different, say, than that hermeneutical view that we talked about in Mesopotamia, with the matter of city that depends on interpret reality. I mean, there is not imposing interpretations.
No, they talk.
Sort of the languages ultimately it's just a transparent medium. And I don't know, there's a reality.
Yeah, and they talk about it as a direct experience, not about, and so really the reasoning that's involved is also, you know, analytical fiction in a way.
Yeah.
So when Shankara talks about how the, you know, the middle stage is reasoning, he's talking about the temporary use of reasoning to remove doubts. Purpose is to remove doubts, but once the doubts are removed, in his view, then it's only then that the word of the Upanishad that says you are that, it's only then that that actually works. And the metaphor he gives, or parable he gives for that, is the story of the 10 young men who have to swim across a dangerous river. And when they reach the other side, one of them counts heads to make sure all 10 are across. But every time he counts, he only counts 9, until one of the other men tells him, "You are the 10." And as soon as he hears that, he knows immediately and completely that all 10 of them are there. That's what Shankara gives as the example of how the word of the Upanishad does its work immediately. But there's a very long process that may be necessary of clearing away the obstacles. That's where these parts come in. But then you see that the parts were never, not only are they no longer necessary, they were never really there. Sureshwara talks about how at the point of enlightenment, the guru disappears, which I think is striking.
There's an element of interaction that somehow survives, I think, in the description of these processes. I don't remember which one of the grammarians says that the grammarians, they're like, it's like somebody looking for a needle in a haystack. They're like messing with the kind of boring and dry materials of grammar, particles and verbs and nouns and all that, but by chance they happened upon God. Yeah, that's what they found. So this. But it's interesting also because they're like two different levels to what the theory you're talking about, I think. There's on the one hand the empirical experience that everybody has. That, let's say you're learning a language. There comes a moment where you don't have to figure it out. You don't have to translate it. You don't have to analyze the parts. You just understand the meaning. It's a holistic event. That's true for all of us. And that's a kind of pure sort of grammatical linguistic phenomenon. But then there's this other kind of knowing, which is not like any other knowing. It's just that's what he means by Shabda here, right? And it's interesting. Yeah. I mean, still, it seems to be a linguistic act of some sort.
Well, that's kind of the mysterious thing. It's what you said, that it's very important to understand what you said, which is that this ultimate experience of language is it's a special experience, which is not any kind of operational language, because at that level there's no subject and object. There's no interaction. There can be no denotation because there's no object that's separate. So Bhartahari approaches this we talked about this a little while ago, the stages of language. That first of all, there's ordinary articulated spoken language in the world, and then there's a subtler level which is called the middle, just called the middle stage, and that I take to be, I'll probably get in trouble with this, I take that to be mental, talking to yourself in your head. It's like mental abuse of language. It's a subtler form. It has
Buddhist.
Yeah.
That's definition in Bhatahari.
Yeah. that it's just in the mind. But beyond that, there's a subtler form, which is called Pashyanti, the witnessing language. And this is identical, I believe, with the original Vedanta view that reality is simply consciousness, pure awareness without an object. And it's a little mysterious why Bhartari says that that is linguistic. But I take them at their word, that if this is something that they actually experienced, there was something in it that to them was linguistic in this pure consciousness that they were able to experience.
I think we're going to have to stop on the verge of enlightenment. Thank you, Jared.
Thanks.
So wait a second. So just a couple of announcements. So in lieu of enlightenment, there's dinner.
Don't rule anything out.
Yeah, and everyone who wants to make sure that at least they get dinner, maybe even enlightenment, please be at 6:45 out there at the bus stand where we hopped on the bus today when we went to, and it's the same bus, okay? It's in, yeah, but it's very close. One more announcement. Tomorrow we will finish an hour earlier than the schedule. So we will combine the tour with the lunch. We'll take the sandwiches or whatever with us, and we'll start 1 hour earlier the afternoon session and finish 1 hour earlier the entire schedule. Okay.
I ran out the door as soon as it finished to get my flight. So that is, yeah, my flight's at 5 to 10. So I want to get to the airport on time, and finishing at 6:15 means that it's doable, but not comfortable considering I'm not. So we need to, figure it out. So that gives me an extra hour. Like,
am I involved in the?
Yeah, they ask a lot of questions at the airport. Like, I hope it's easier to leave.
I thought they wouldn't let me in when I got here.
Yeah.
Honestly, I thought they were going to turn me away. They're asking questions about my parents' names, the history of the family, which I didn't know because of something I've never met. They wanted all my documentation, my acceptance letter for this. They wanted, I don't know if you got the same.
They didn't ask me the acceptance letter. I had someone who was really, really young. Knew that she was in training, so every so often she'd ask me questions, and then she'd go.
I was telling David,
more questions. But it took a long time.
Yeah, I don't think my woman believed me when I said I was attending a school conference in Jerusalem. She looked at the letter and she was like,
I'm sure this is real.
yeah. Do you have a new family here? And I was like, no. But I got